Tonight, we're diving into the whole of it. The entire story of Harry Potter. All 7 years and all 7 books gathered into one long, gentle telling. From a baby left sleeping on a doorstep to a grown man watching a train pull out of a station 19 years on. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing to solve here and nothing to fear, only a slow, steady voice carrying you, chapter by chapter, toward sleep. If these long, quiet stories are the ones that finally get you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night. And that is the only thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters we will move, without haste, through the years that made him, the letters and the hidden world, the friendships and the fears, the long wandering in the cold, and at last the calm of a story finished and set down. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Let it move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down toward rest. The doorstep where that baby lay belonged to a house called Number 4, Privet Drive, in the town of Little Winging, in the quiet county of Surrey, and it was, on the outside, the most ordinary house on the most ordinary street you could imagine. Inside it lived Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, who were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. And who would have been the last people in the world to expect anything strange or mysterious, because they simply did not hold with such things. Mr. Dursley, whose name was Vernon, was a large, beefy man with hardly any neck, and he was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. Mrs. Dursley, whose name was Petunia, was thin and blonde and had a neck almost twice the usual length, which came in very useful, for she spent much of her time craning it over garden fences to keep watch on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere in the world. They had everything they wanted, and they had one thing more that they very much did not want, which was a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They did not think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but the two of them had not met for several years, and Mrs. Dursley pretended, on the whole, that she had no sister at all, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as unlike the Dursleys as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters ever arrived in their street. They knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him, and this boy was one more good reason for keeping the Potters away. And so it was that on one gray and cloudy Tuesday, as our story truly begins, the Dursleys woke into a morning that gave no hint at all of the strange and wonderful things that would soon be happening all over the country. It began with small things, the sort a busy man might easily overlook. As Mr. Dursley drove toward his office that dull morning, he thought for a moment that he saw a cat reading a map, a tabby cat with markings around its eyes, sitting stiff and still upon the corner of the street. He blinked and looked again, and the cat was only a cat, staring back at him, so he shook the thought away and turned his mind to the drills he hoped to sell that day. But as he sat in the long lines of traffic, he could not help noticing that there seemed to be a great many oddly dressed people about, people in cloaks of emerald and violet and midnight blue, huddling together in whispering knots on the pavement, far too cheerful and far too colorful for a chilly Tuesday in Surrey. And once, near a baker's shop, he was quite sure he caught the murmur of certain names, the Potters and their little boy Harry, though he told himself, firmly, that it was none of his business, and hurried inside for a bun. By evening the signs had grown too many to ignore, and the whole of the wizarding world, unseen by the Dursleys and their neighbors, was quietly rejoicing. Owls swooped through the daylight sky in numbers that made ordinary people point and gasp, though owls are creatures of the night. Shooting stars fell in bright showers over the distant county of Kent, and men and women in long robes toasted one another in the streets and spoke, in hushed and joyful voices, of something they had scarcely dared to hope for. For a shadow that had lain over their world for many long years had that very day lifted a dark and terrible wizard, whose name most of them were still too frightened to speak, and so called instead, you-know-who, had risen to great and dreadful power, gathering followers and spreading fear until it seemed that no light could stand against him. And then, on the night just past, that shadow had somehow, impossibly, been broken. At Godric's Hollow, where a young family had been hiding, the dark wizard had come at last for the Potters. James Potter had fallen first, and then Lily, his wife, who had stood between the cradle and the danger and would not step aside. And then the dark wizard had turned his wand upon the child, a little boy just over 1 year old, and had spoken the curse that ends a life, the curse that no one had ever survived. Yet something happened that night that no one has ever fully explained, for the curse did not take the child. Instead, it rebounded, turning back upon the one who had cast it, and in that instant the dark wizard's power was shattered, and his body was undone, and he vanished from the world, leaving only a whisper of himself behind. The child lived. The only mark left upon him was a small, thin scar upon his forehead, shaped like a bolt of lightning. And from that night onward, he would be known, in every corner of the hidden world, as the boy who lived. It was for his sake that the strange gathering came, at last, to the ordinary corner of Privet Drive. Late that night, long after the Dursleys had gone to bed, an old and stately man appeared upon the pavement as though he had risen straight out of the darkness. His name was Albus Dumbledore, and he had a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles and eyes that were bright and kind and very tired. From his cloak, he drew a small silver device, something like a cigarette lighter, and with a soft click, he drew the light out of the 12 street lamps, one by one, until the street lay in deep and gentle shadow, and only the eyes of a tabby cat gleamed from the low garden wall. And the cat, as he came near, unfolded itself and rose, and became a stern woman in emerald robes and square spectacles. Professor Minerva McGonagall, who had waited there the whole long day. Quietly, in the dark, the two old friends spoke of all that had come to pass, of the celebrations and the sorrow, of James and Lily gone, and of the boy who had survived. Dumbledore had decided that the child would be given to his only living family, to his aunt and uncle in this very house, so that he might grow up far from the fame and the whispers, an ordinary boy in an ordinary place, until he was old enough one day to understand who he truly was. And then, from high above, there came a low rumble, and down out of the sky drifted a motorcycle of enormous size, flying, and upon it sat a giant of a man with a wild tangle of black hair and beard, Rubeus Hagrid, who had borrowed the machine from a young man named Sirius Black. Cradled in one of his great arms, wrapped in blankets and fast asleep, lay the baby. With the gentlest of hands, the old man took the sleeping child and carried him up the short garden path, and laid him down upon the doorstep of number 4, tucking a letter in beside the blankets to explain, as best a letter could, all that had happened and all that was being asked. The three of them stood a moment in the dark and quiet street, and then they turned away, and Hagrid climbed onto the flying motorcycle and rose into the night, and the woman became a cat once more and slipped into the shadows, and the old man clicked his little silver device and gave the street back its light and walked away without a backward glance. And so the baby slept on, not stirring, knowing nothing of the small scar upon his brow, nothing of the mother who had died to save him, nothing of the countless strangers across the country who were, at that very hour, lifting their glasses to a child they had never met. Up next in Chapter 2, A Letter, a Giant, and a Hidden World, we'll follow that sleeping boy across 10 long and lonely years. To the morning, the letters began to arrive, and a great kind stranger came at last to carry him away. The years that followed the doorstep were quiet ones for the boy, though not gentle in the way that quiet ought to be. He grew up inside number 4, Privet Drive, in the tidy little town of Little Winging in Surrey, and for the whole of his childhood his bedroom was the cupboard under the stairs, a low and dusty space of spiders and a single bare bulb, tucked beneath the very steps his aunt and uncle climbed each night to their own soft beds. Vernon and Petunia Dursley had taken him in without warmth, and their son Dudley, round and spoiled and given to shrieking, learned early that his cousin was a thing to be pushed aside. And so Harry grew thin and small and watchful, wearing clothes handed down until they hung on him like sacks, told again and again that his parents had died in a common car crash, told that there was nothing special about him at all, and believing it, for he had no reason yet to believe anything else. Strange things happened around him now and then. Hair grown back overnight, a jumper that shrank away from his head, a sudden leap onto a school roof that no one could explain, but each strangeness was punished rather than wondered at, and the boy tucked his questions away and kept them quietly to himself. Then, in the summer he turned 11, a letter came. It arrived on an ordinary morning among the ordinary post, an envelope of heavy yellowish parchment, addressed in emerald green ink to Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, and the very precision of that address, naming the small dark place where he slept, was the first sign that someone out in the world knew exactly where he was and had chosen, at last, to reach him. Uncle Vernon snatched it away before Harry could so much as open it, his great face going from red to gray, and from that moment the house became a fortress against the mail. But the letters would not stop. Where one had come, 2 came the next day, and then 4, and then a dozen, slid beneath the door and pushed through the cracks around it. Vernon nailed shut the letterbox and boarded over the seams, and still they arrived, folded inside the eggs from the milkman, whistling down through the chimney to scatter across the sitting room like a flock of pale birds. In the end, half mad with the impossibility of it, he bundled his family into the car and drove, until at last he found a miserable little shack of a hut perched on a rock, far out in a cold and heaving sea, and there, cut off by the storm and the water, he believed himself finally safe. He was not safe. As the clock crawled toward midnight, and the wind battered the walls, and the boy lay on the cold floor quietly counting the last minutes down to his 11th birthday, there came a great booming knock upon the door, and then another, and then the whole door was lifted clean from its hinges and set aside, and into that tiny hut stepped the largest man that any of them had ever seen. He was very nearly twice the height of an ordinary person, and easily 5 times as broad, with a wild black beard and small kind eyes glinting like beetles beneath a mane of tangled hair, and though his size might have frightened, Everything else about him spoke of gentleness. This was Rubeus Hagrid, the keeper of keys and grounds at a place called Hogwarts, and he had crossed sea and storm for one reason only, to find the boy at last and tell him the truth. From somewhere inside his enormous coat, he drew out a slightly squashed chocolate cake with the words "Happy Birthday" written across it in green icing, made with his own great clumsy hands, and he gave it to the boy who had never in his life been given a birthday cake before. And then, sitting in that firelit hut with the wind howling outside, Hagrid told Harry the thing that changed the whole shape of the world. He told him that he was a wizard, that his mother and father had been a witch and a wizard of no small gift, and that they had not died in any car crash at all, but had been murdered by a dark and terrible sorcerer whose name most people were still too afraid to speak. He told him that Harry alone had survived that night, marked forever by the lightning scar upon his brow, and that among their kind he was famous, known to every wizard child as the boy who lived. He drew out a letter, the same letter that had chased the family across the country, and this time no one snatched it away, and it welcomed Harry Potter to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. When Uncle Vernon rose up sputtering and dared to insult the great old headmaster who had watched over Harry all these years, Hagrid lost his patience just once, and with a twist of his pink umbrella, he gave the shrieking Dudley a small curly pig's tail. And after that, the Dursleys shrank into a corner and troubled them no further. The next morning, the giant led the boy back across the water and into the ordinary bustle of London, and there, behind a shabby little pub called the Leaky Cauldron, that no ordinary passerby could even see, he tapped a certain brick in a certain plain brick wall, and the wall folded itself apart to reveal the hidden world entire. It was a long, winding, cobbled street called Diagon Alley, crowded and cheerful and lit with lamplight, its shops spilling over with cauldrons and broomsticks, with barrels of bat spleens and eel's eyes, with owls and toads and stacks of spellbooks bound in strange leathers, and the boy walked down it with his mouth open, feeling that he had at last stepped through into the place he had somehow always belonged. They went first to Gringotts, the towering marble bank run by the sharp, clever goblins, and rode a rattling little cart deep beneath the city to a vault that held a small mountain of gold and silver and bronze coins, galleons and sickles and nuts, all of it left for Harry by the parents he had believed had left him nothing. Hagrid stopped at one other vault as well, a deep and heavily guarded one, and took from it a small, grubby brown package on the quiet business of the headmaster, and he would say nothing at all about what it was. Then came the happy hours of buying everything a young wizard needs: plain black robes fitted at the tailor's shop, a cauldron and scales and folding brass instruments, heavy armfuls of schoolbooks, and, as a birthday gift the boy would never forget, a beautiful snowy owl with feathers like fresh snow, whom he would come to call Hedwig. And last of all they came to a narrow, dusty, half-forgotten shop where the finest wands in Britain had been made for many centuries, and there the boy learned a curious truth, that it is the wand which chooses the wizard, and not the other way around. After many tries and many failures, one wand at last sent warm red and gold sparks streaming from its tip, 11 inches long, made of holly, with a single feather from the tail of a phoenix at its heart. And the old wand-maker grew very thoughtful and very still, for that same phoenix had given only one other feather in all its life, and that other feather rested inside the wand of the very sorcerer who had given Harry his scar. It was a strange and heavy thing to carry away, this sense that his fate and the Dark One's were somehow twined together. But the day was ending, and the wonder was too great. And the boy simply held his new wand close and let himself be happy. Up next in Chapter 3, Platform 9 3/4, will the weeks that followed the visit to Diagon Alley passed slowly for the boy, who had returned to the small back bedroom of number 4, Privet Drive, carrying with him a trunk of strange and wonderful things and a snowy owl he had named Hedwig. He spent long summer evenings drawing up a countdown on a scrap of paper, marking off each day that separated him from the 1st of September, and the great blank ache of not belonging, the ache he had carried for as long as he could remember, seemed for the first time in his life to have an ending somewhere in sight. The Dursleys, uneasy in the presence of the caged owl and the spellbooks, kept their distance, and Harry, for his part, was content to sit quietly with his new textbooks open upon his knees, reading of star charts and simple charms by the last of the fading light. When at last the morning came, it arrived gray and ordinary, and Uncle Vernon, in a mood that was almost cheerful at the thought of being rid of the boy for the better part of a year, agreed to drive him to King's Cross Station. They loaded the heavy trunk onto a trolley, wheeled it in among the crowds of hurrying travelers, and came to a halt between Platform 9 and Platform 10. There Uncle Vernon left him with a cruel sort of amusement, for Harry's ticket read Platform 9 3/4, and there was no such platform to be seen, only a solid brick barrier standing between the two ordinary ones, and the giant who had bought him that ticket had forgotten, in all his kindness, to explain how a boy was meant to reach it. Harry stood alone with his trolley and his owl, feeling the old helplessness begin to rise, until his ear caught a single word carried above the noise of the station, the word Muggles, spoken by a plump woman with a kindly face and hair as red as fire. She was surrounded by children every bit as red-headed as herself, and she was shepherding them, one by one, toward the barrier between the platforms. Harry watched, hardly daring to hope, as the eldest boy walked briskly at the solid brick and passed clean through it, vanishing as though the wall were made of nothing but mist. A pair of identical twins followed, laughing, and then the woman, seeing Harry's wonder and guessing at once that this was his very first journey to the school, told him gently what to do. He was to walk straight at the barrier, and not to stop, and not to be afraid, and if he felt at all nervous, it was best to take it at a little run. So Harry gripped the handle of his trolley, fixed his eyes upon the barrier, and ran. He braced himself for a collision that never came. Instead, he found himself upon a new platform altogether, where a scarlet steam engine waited beside a crowd, thick with cloaked witches and wizards, and a sign overhead read Hogwarts Express, 11 o'clock. Smoke drifted lazily over the heads of the chattering crowd, cats of every color wound between the legs of the travelers, and owls hooted crossly to one another over the general din. It was, to Harry, the most wonderful place he had ever in his life stood. The two red-headed twins, seeing him struggling to lift his heavy trunk up into a carriage, came at once to his aid, and in the doing of it, they caught sight of the thin lightning-shaped scar upon his forehead, and understood, with a kind of hushed awe, exactly who he was. Word of it seemed to ripple outward along the platform, and a small red-headed girl, the youngest of that family, begged her mother to let her climb aboard for a closer look at the famous boy. But the great clock was already moving toward 11, and there was no more time left for looking. Harry found himself an empty compartment near the end of the train, settled Hedwig's cage upon the rack, and pressed his face to the window as the whistle sounded and the scarlet engine began, very slowly, to move, carrying him out of the gray city and away. Before long, the youngest of the red-headed boys, A tall, thin lad with a smudge upon his nose and robes that had plainly been worn by older brothers before him, asked whether the seat across from Harry was taken, and settled himself down to share the journey. His name was Ron Weasley, and he carried with him a fat gray rat named Scabbers, a hand-me-down like so much else that belonged to him, along with a squashed parcel of sandwiches his mother had packed and that he did not much care for. The two boys fell easily into the comfortable talk of the very young, of families and broomsticks and the castle that waited at the far end of the line, and Harry, who had never once in his life had a friend, felt something loosen and quietly settle within his chest. Somewhere past the middle of the morning, a smiling witch came rattling along the corridor with a trolley piled high with sweets, and Harry, who had never before had money of his own to spend, bought a little of everything and spread the whole feast across the seat between them. There were Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, which lived up to their name in ways both delightful and dreadful, and chocolate frogs that gave a single lifelike hop before they were caught, each one packaged with a card bearing the moving portrait of a famous witch or wizard. The first frog Harry opened held a card for Albus Dumbledore, the great and gentle headmaster of Hogwarts, and as the two boys watched, the little painted figure smiled up at them and then wandered quietly out of the edge of his own frame. A little later, the door slid open once again to admit a round-faced boy named Neville Longbottom, who had lost his toad, Trevor, and with him a girl already dressed in her school robes, with a great deal of bushy brown hair and a rather bossy, eager manner. Her name was Hermione Granger, and though she came from a family with no magic in it at all, she had read every one of her school books from cover to cover and had already learned a good many things by heart. She had even, she told them, come across Harry's own name in several of her histories, and she studied him with frank and curious interest before turning her attention to correcting Ron's clumsy attempt at a spell. Not long before the journey's end, a pale boy with a pointed face and sleek fair hair came looking for Harry along the train, flanked by two large and sullen companions. He introduced himself as Draco Malfoy, and he offered his hand along with a great deal of scornful advice about the sort of company a famous boy ought to keep, sneering openly at Ron's shabby robes and freckled face. But Harry had already made his own quiet choice of friends, and he refused the offered hand, and the pale boy withdrew with cold displeasure, leaving a small chill behind him in the little compartment. At last, as the sky darkened into a deep and velvet autumn blue, the train slowed and came to rest at a tiny platform, and a great booming voice called for the first years to gather round. It belonged to Hagrid, the kindly giant, holding a lamp high above the sea of small, frightened faces, and he led them down a steep and narrow path to the shore of a wide black lake. There a little fleet of boats waited, no more than 4 children to each, and as they glided out across the still dark water, the castle rose slowly into view above them, perched high upon its mountain, its many turrets and towers bright, with 1,000 windows against the night. The boats carried them beneath a curtain of trailing ivy and into a hidden harbor. Trevor the Toad was found again at last, and the first years climbed a passage in the rock until they stood together, small and hushed and full of wonder, before the great oak doors of Hogwarts. Up next, in Chapter 4, The Sorting and the Stone Beneath the School, we'll follow those hushed first years through the doors and into the candlelit hall, where an old and tattered hat will decide, one gentle name at a time, exactly where each of them is meant to belong, and where a locked door on the 3rd floor will begin, ever so softly, to whisper of what lies waiting beneath the school. When the scarlet train at last slowed and sighed to a halt. The platform beyond it was dark and cool, and the first years were drawn from the crowd by a lantern swinging high in a great hand. Hagrid gathered the smallest and newest of them and led them down a narrow, sloping path, and there, without warning, the trees fell away, and the lake lay open and black and still. On its far shore, crowning a high crag, stood the castle of Hogwarts, its many windows glowing gold against the night sky, its towers rising one behind another like something remembered from a dream. Small boats waited at the water's edge, and the children climbed in without needing to be told, and the little fleet slid out across the smooth water on its own, gliding beneath a curtain of ivy and into a hidden harbor in the rock beneath the school. In this way, quietly and by water, Harry came for the first time to the place that would hold the whole of his growing. Up a passage of damp stone they went, until they came to great oak doors, where a tall witch in emerald robes was waiting for them. This was Professor Minerva McGonagall, stern and straight and fair, and she brought them into a small chamber to explain the way of things, that they were about to be sorted into one of 4 houses, and that those houses would be something like a family to them for all their years within these walls. The 4 were Gryffindor, whose sign was the lion and whose virtue was courage; Hufflepuff, patient and loyal and true; Ravenclaw, quick of mind and eager to learn; and Slytherin, cunning and ambitious and proud. Each had been founded, long ago, by one of the 4 great witches and wizards whose names the houses still carried: Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. Before Harry had time to grow truly afraid, the doors opened, and the first years were led out into the vast great hall, where hundreds of faces turned toward them, and the ceiling above was enchanted to show the night sky, a soft scatter of stars floating over rows of drifting candles. At the front of the hall stood a simple wooden stool, and upon it a very old and patched pointed hat, and after a moment of stillness, the hat opened a seam near its brim and sang. It sang of the 4 founders and of what each had prized, and it promised that there was nothing hidden in any young head that it could not see. And so, one by one, the children came forward and placed it upon their brows. A girl with a great deal of brown hair, Hermione Granger, was sent quickly to the table beneath the scarlet and gold. A round-faced and anxious boy, Neville Longbottom, went the same way after a long and thoughtful pause. A pale boy named Draco Malfoy was claimed by Slytherin almost before the hat had touched him, and the many red-haired Weasleys were gathered, as they always were, into Gryffindor, the youngest brother Ron among them. When Harry's own name was called, a whisper ran round the hall, and beneath the brim, in the private dark, the hat murmured that he might do well in Slytherin, that there was courage in him, and a thirst to prove himself. But Harry thought, quietly and firmly, that he would rather be anywhere else, and the hat, hearing him, sent him at last to Gryffindor, where the table roared its welcome. So it was decided, by a soft choice made under an old hat, that his path would run beside Ron and Hermione and not apart from them. At the high table sat the teachers, and above them all, in a great golden chair, sat Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster, silver-bearded and half-moon spectacled and kind. He rose only to say a few gentle, nonsensical words, and then the empty golden plates filled of their own accord with more food than the children had ever seen. The ghosts of the castle drifted among them as they ate, nearly headless Nick of Gryffindor and the sorrowful Grey Lady and the plump fat friar and the grim bloody baron, so that even the dead seemed only another quiet part of this warm and living place. Yet before the feast was done, Dumbledore added one soft warning to the evening. that the corridor on the 3rd floor, on the right-hand side, was forbidden to anyone who did not wish to die a most painful death, and the words settled over the hall like a small cold draught before the candles and the sleep took everyone up to their towers. The year that followed unrolled slowly, as school years do. There were classes in the changing of one thing into another with Professor McGonagall, and in charms with the tiny Professor Flitwick, and in the brewing of potions in a cold dungeon with Professor Snape, whose dark eyes seemed to rest upon Harry with a particular and unexplained dislike. There was the defense against the dark arts, taught by the stammering, purple-turbaned Professor Quirrell, whose classroom carried a faint and curious smell. On a bright, sharp morning the first years were taught to fly. And it was there that Harry discovered the one thing his body seemed to have always known how to do, so that before long he was made the youngest seeker in a century and given a fine broom to carry him through the game of Quidditch. On the night of Halloween, a mountain troll blundered into the castle, and in the fright and the rescue that followed, Harry and Ron and Hermione were bound together into a friendship that would not come undone. And all the while a small mystery turned beneath the ordinary days of a break-in at the Wizarding Bank on the very day Harry had visited it, of a grubby little package moved to safekeeping, and of a great 3-headed dog named Fluffy that stood guard. They slowly realized. Over a trapdoor in that same forbidden corridor. Piece by gentle piece, the 3 friends gathered the truth. The thing beneath the school was the Philosopher's Stone, made long ago by the ancient alchemist Nicholas Flamel, a stone that turned metal to gold and gave its keeper a life without end. Something wanted it badly enough to kill for it, and so, on a quiet and fearful night, the 3 of them went down through the trapdoor themselves. They lulled the great dog to sleep with music, as Hagrid had let slip that one might. And then they passed through the trials the teachers had laid to guard the way. There were strangling vines that loosened only when one stopped struggling and grew calm. There was a room of winged keys where Harry's flying carried him to the one small battered key that fit the lock. There was a giant chessboard where Ron played and, without complaint, gave himself up to be struck down so that his friends could go on. And there was a table of potions and a riddle in verse, which Hermione's careful mind unraveled, sending Harry forward alone through a curtain of black flame. Beyond it he found not the sallow Snape he had feared, but nervous Professor Quirrell. And behind Quirrell, hidden all year beneath the turban, the ruined face of Lord Voldemort himself, feeding upon the weaker man. Before them stood a tall mirror that showed each looker the deepest wish of his heart, and in its glass Harry saw himself holding the very stone, and felt it drop, cool and real, into his pocket. For the mirror would yield the treasure only to one who wished to find it, and never to use it. Voldemort commanded that the boy be seized, but at every touch the man's hands blistered and burned, for the love that had marked Harry as a baby still lay upon his skin like a shield. And so, clinging on until the pain grew too great to bear, Harry saw the dark thing flee, and then the light left him, and he fell. Up next in Chapter 5, The Whispering Chamber and the Diary, we'll drift into his 2nd year at Hogwarts, where a cold voice slides through the stone of the walls, and an old black book remembers far more than any book ever should. When the long first year folded quietly shut, and the enchanted stone that had drawn a thin shadow of Voldemort back toward the living world was destroyed and set forever beyond reach, Harry returned for the summer to the narrow grey house on Privet Drive, carrying the whole hidden castle inside him like a warm secret he was not allowed to speak. Yet the second year did not begin with a scarlet train. It began, softly and strangely, with a warning. On a still evening, while the Dursleys entertained guests they hoped would make them rich, a small creature with enormous eyes and long bat-like ears appeared upon Harry's bed. His name was Dobby, and he was a house elf, bound in servitude to a cruel family, and he had come, trembling and wringing his hands, to beg Harry not to return to Hogwarts, for a terrible danger was gathering there. To make his point, Dobby confessed that he had been quietly hiding all of Harry's letters through the long, lonely summer, so that the boy might believe his friends had forgotten him and choose to stay away. When Harry refused, Dobby caused a violent commotion downstairs, and Harry was punished, and bars were fitted to his window as though he were a prisoner. He was rescued in the deep of night by 3 of the Weasley brothers, Ron and the twins, Fred and George, who arrived in a battered, enchanted blue Ford Anglia that flew. They wrenched the bars from the wall and carried him off through the dark air to the crooked, welcoming warmth of the burrow, where Molly Weasley fussed and fed him, and the household went on in its cheerful, ramshackle magic. But when the time came to return to school, the passage onto platform 9 3/4 had been sealed by Dobby's meddling, and Harry and Ron, unable to reach the train, made the reckless choice to follow it north in the flying car. The journey ended when the enchantment failed and the car fell out of the sky into the branches of the Whomping Willow, a violent old tree that beat them soundly before spitting them out onto the grass. The battered car wandered off alone into the forbidden forest, and the boys, bruised and lucky, slipped into a year already shadowed. That year brought a new teacher of defense against the dark arts, the golden-haired and endlessly smiling Gilderoy Lockhart, a man in love with his own fame and the many books that bore his name, though little of the courage in them was truly his. It brought, too, a stranger and colder thing. On the night of Halloween, as the castle glowed with feasting, Harry began to hear a voice no one else could hear, a low and hungry hissing that slid through the stone as though it lived inside the walls, whispering of ripping and tearing and killing. He alone could hear it, because he alone, without yet understanding it, could speak the language of serpents. Following that whispering, the 3 friends came upon a message painted in dripping letters upon a corridor wall, telling all who passed that the Chamber of Secrets had been opened, and that the enemies of the air should beware. Beneath the words hung the caretaker's cat, Mrs. Norris, stiff and cold as glass, not dead, but petrified, frozen in a single stare. The old story rose then out of the school's memory, told in the dusty voice of Professor Binns. Long ago, 1,000 years past, 4 great witches and wizards had founded Hogwarts together, Godric Gryffindor and Helga Hufflepuff, and Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. In time, Slytherin quarreled bitterly with the others, for he wished to teach only children of holy magical blood and to shut the doors against all the rest. When he could not have his way, he left the school, but before he went he was said to have built a hidden chamber deep beneath it, sealed against every founder but his own true heir. Within it, the legend held, he had hidden a monster, a creature that his heir alone could waken and command, so that one day the school might be purged of every student he deemed unworthy. For centuries it had been dismissed as a tale. Now, one by one, the victims came. A young boy named Colin Creevey was found petrified beside his camera. The ghost of nearly headless Nick and a Hufflepuff boy, Justin Finch Fletchley, were struck rigid together in a dim passage. Fear settled over the castle like a slow, cold fog, and suspicion turned cruelly upon Harry, for the whole school had learned by then that he could speak to snakes, and old fear made an easy monster of a boy. Determined to find the true heir, Hermione brewed a difficult and forbidden polyjuice potion in a flooded, half-abandoned bathroom haunted by the mournful ghost of a girl called Moaning Myrtle. With it, Harry and Ron took on the shapes of Slytherin boys and questioned Draco Malfoy, only to learn that he knew nothing, that he was as ignorant of the heir as they were. The trail seemed to close. Then, in the wet ruin of Myrtle's bathroom, Harry found a small, worn diary, its pages blank, bearing the name Tom Marvolo Riddle. When he set his quill to it, the book wrote back, gentle and reasonable and warm, and drew him down into a memory 50 years old, where a younger Riddle, a clever and admired student, showed Harry how he had once caught the boy blamed for the chamber's first opening. That boy had been Hagrid, expelled and disgraced, and the true culprit, Riddle had let the world believe, was a great spider Hagrid kept. Riddle had been praised and rewarded, and the school had gone on trusting him. But the diary was a lie wrapped around a deeper one, for the letters of the name Tom Marvolo Riddle, rearranged, spelled out the title he had chosen for himself. I am Lord Voldemort. Slowly the answer gathered. Hermione, working alone in the library, found it at last and was petrified before she could speak it, her hand still closed around a torn page that named the monster. It was a basilisk, a monstrous serpent whose direct gaze brought instant death, though each victim had by chance seen it only sidelong, through a camera, a reflection, a ghost, a pool of water, and so had been frozen rather than killed. It had moved unseen through the castle's great plumbing, and its lair, the true Chamber of Secrets, lay behind a serpent-marked tap in the very bathroom where the girl Myrtle had died half a century before, the first to fall to its stare. The last horror came when a message announced that a student had been taken down into the chamber itself, and the student was Ginny Weasley, Ron's small sister, who all year had poured her heart into the innocent-seeming diary and been slowly hollowed out by the memory of Voldemort living inside it. Harry and Ron, dragging the cowardly Lockhart along, opened the hidden passage when Harry hissed to the stone in the serpent's tongue, and they slid down into the dark. Lockhart, trying to flee, seized a broken wand and had his own memory blasted away, sealing the tunnel behind him and leaving Harry to go on alone. In the drowned green gloom of the chamber, he found Ginny cold and fading, and Riddle's shape grown almost solid, feeding upon her life. Then came a burst of song, and Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes, dropped the tattered sorting hat into Harry's hands, and from the hat he drew a gleaming sword. The basilisk rose, vast and blind, for Fawkes had already torn out its deadly eyes. Half by courage and half by luck, Harry drove the sword up through the roof of its mouth, and as a poisoned fang tore into his arm, he plunged that same fang into the diary. Ink spilled like black blood, Riddle's shape screamed and unraveled into nothing, and Ginny woke, and the phoenix wept its healing tears into the wound. Hagrid was freed, Dumbledore restored, and with a clever gift of a single sock, Harry set the little elf Dobby free at last. Up next in Chapter 6, The Prisoner and the Marauders, we'll follow a name that broke out of a fortress no one had ever escaped, and drift slowly through the story of a father, his friends, and the map that remembered them all. When the ruined diary had at last gone silent, and the great serpent had crumbled into stillness beneath the school, a kind of ordinary calm settled over Harry's world for a little while, and the summer that followed carried him, as summers always did, back to the narrow house on Privet Drive, where he was least wanted. Yet the peace did not hold, For a swelling temper and an unkind visiting aunt drove him, one warm evening, to lose his careful grip on the small magic he was forbidden to use, and the woman who had sneered at his parents floated slowly up toward the ceiling like a great inflated balloon. Frightened and furious in equal measure, Harry gathered his trunk and his owl and walked out into the dark, certain that he had broken the law of his hidden world beyond all forgiveness. And there, at the edge of a shadowed street, a violently purple triple-decker bus came screeching out of nowhere to gather stranded witches and wizards through the night. The bus set him down at last in Diagon Alley, where, to his very great surprise, the Minister for Magic himself met him not with punishment, but with a strange, anxious kindness. And Harry spent the final golden days of the holiday wandering the cobbled lane in peace, unaware that the gentleness hid a fear the grown-ups would not name aloud, for a prisoner had done the impossible. From the fortress of Azkaban, out upon its cold gray sea, guarded by the soul-draining creatures called Dementors, a man named Sirius Black had escaped, the first ever to slip free of that terrible place, and every worried whisper in the wizarding world seemed to say that he was coming for Harry. The Scarlet Train carried its passengers north, as it always had, but this year, the long journey turned suddenly cold. For the lamps guttered and frost crept across the windows, and one of the Dementors, tall and hooded and drawing every warmth and joy out of the air, glided into the compartment in search of the escaped man. Harry, who had lost more than most, felt the creature reach deep inside him and pull at his oldest grief, and he heard, from very far away, a woman screaming before the world slid into darkness. A tired, shabby, gentle man who had been sleeping in the corner rose then and drove the thing back with a sudden burst of silver light, and afterward he pressed a piece of chocolate into Harry's hand. For chocolate, he knew, was the surest small comfort against despair. His name was Remus Lupin, and he was to be their new teacher of defense against the dark arts. The Dementors were set to guard the school gates through all the long year, and their nearness soured the quiet days. But within the castle, Professor Lupin proved the kindest and best of teachers. In one bright and memorable lesson, he let his students face a shape-shifting boggart that became each pupil's worst fear, and taught them to laugh it into something absurd and harmless. Because the Dementors reached into Harry more deeply than into anyone else, Lupin agreed to teach him, in the hush of empty evenings, a single, very difficult piece of magic, the Patronus charm, in which a wizard must fix his whole mind upon one bright and happy memory and cast from his wand a guardian of pure silver light to hold the cold and the darkness at bay. Elsewhere in the wide grounds, gentle Hagrid had been made a teacher too, and on his very first day he introduced the class to a hippogriff named Buckbeak, a proud creature half horse and half great eagle, who bowed only to those who first bowed low to him. Harry treated the animal with quiet courtesy and was carried, for one soaring moment, high above the shining lake, but Draco Malfoy, careless and scornful, insulted the beast and was cut for it, and though the wound was slight indeed, his powerful family pressed hard for the creature to be sentenced to death. Through the darkening term, Harry learned, in slow and painful pieces, why the escaped prisoner was said to want him dead, for the grown-ups spoke in low voices of how Sirius Black had once been his father's dearest friend, and how he was believed to have betrayed the Potters to the Dark Lord, and to have murdered, with a single curse, another old companion and 12 strangers besides. Forbidden from visiting the little village of Hogsmeade, Harry was given by Fred and George Weasley a worn piece of old parchment that had belonged to a band of mischief makers long ago. The Marauder's map, which showed every corridor and hidden passage of the castle and every soul who walked them, signed by 4 strange names: Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. The truth, when it came at last, came all at once on a wild and windy night near the very end of the year. A great black dog, which many had taken for an omen of death, seized Ron and dragged him through the roots of the violent whomping willow and down into the tunnel beneath, and Harry and Hermione followed into the dust and shadow of the old shrieking shack. There the dog rose up into a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, Sirius Black himself. And there, slowly and gently, the tangled story was unknotted. Professor Lupin arrived, and instead of a fight the 2 old friends embraced, for they had been, in their school days, 2 of the 4 marauders who had made the map together. Lupin was a werewolf, and the shack and the tunnel had been built long ago so that he might transform in secret and harm no one, and his 3 friends, out of pure love for him, had become animagi to keep him company through those wild nights, taking the shapes of a dog, a stag, and a small rat. And it was the rat that held the very heart of it, for the ragged little pet that Ron had kept and loved for years was no true rat at all, but the 4th marauder, Peter Pettigrew, who had hidden away in that borrowed shape for 12 long years. He, and not Sirius, had been the secret keeper of the Potters. He, and not Sirius, had betrayed them to their deaths, and then framed his friend and fled into the dark. Sirius had suffered all those years in Azkaban for a crime that was Pettigrew's alone, and he was no murderer at all, but Harry's own godfather, the nearest thing to family the boy had left in the world. They meant to bring the cowering traitor up to the castle to prove the truth at last. But the moon rose full and white over the grounds, and Lupin, who had forgotten to take his potion, began to change, and in the chaos Pettigrew slipped once more into his rat shape and vanished into the long grass. The Dementors closed in beside the Black Lake, and Harry and Sirius were dragged toward the very edge of a fate worse than death, until a single blazing Patronus in the shape of a great silver stag came galloping across the water and drove the whole swarm back into the night. Harry, faint and failing, could not see who had cast it. What he did not yet understand, Hermione soon showed him, for she had carried all year a small golden hourglass, a time-turner, that let her sit 2 lessons at once. And now the wise headmaster quietly bid the 2 of them turn it back 3 hours and set right what could still be set right. Moving unseen through their own past, they freed the hippogriff Buckbeak from beneath the falling axe. And Harry, waiting hidden by the lake, understood at last that the great stag had been his own. Cast by his own hand, its shape the very form his father had once taken, as the stag they had called Prongs. Upon Buckbeak's broad and feathered back Sirius rose into the wide night sky and away to freedom, a fugitive still, yet alive, and no longer alone in the truth. By morning the secret of Lupin's nature had quietly spread, and the gentle teacher, sorrowful and unsurprised, packed his worn case and left the school he had loved rather than trouble frightened parents. And so the year drew to a far softer close than it had begun, with a traitor loosed once more upon the world, and a friend departed. Yet with something Harry had never before been given: a godfather who loved him, a living thread back to his father and his father's laughing friends, and the quiet comfort of knowing that somewhere beneath the same wide sky a man upon a winged horse was watching over him. Up next in Chapter 7, the Goblet, and the Graveyard, will follow him into a tournament of champions and a night in a cold, dark place where an old fear returns to the world. After the prisoner had flown away on the back of a great gray hippogriff, and the traitor who wore a rat's shape had slipped once more into the dark, the world turned slowly toward its fourth summer. The boy who had lately learned so much about his father's old friends found himself carried, in time, toward a wider and stranger stage than any he had yet walked, for that same escaped rat had gone creeping across the country in search of the master he had once served. Far away, in the ruins of an old house upon a hill above a village called Little Hangleton, something that was barely alive had begun, patiently and without haste, to gather back to itself the scattered pieces of a body. The summer opened with a wonder. Harry was taken by the Weasley family to the final of the Quidditch World Cup, and he stood among 100,000 witches and wizards in a great hidden stadium beneath the night sky, watching Ireland and Bulgaria wheel and dive far overhead. He saw Victor Krum, the young Bulgarian seeker, fold his arms and drop like a stone through the floodlit air. And though Bulgaria caught the tiny golden snitch at the very end, it was Ireland who won the match, and the tents afterward glowed green and gold long into the small hours. Yet the joy turned cold before the dawn. Deep in that night, the campground filled with screaming and firelight, for a company of masked figures had come marching through the tents, lifting a helpless Muggle family high into the air for cruel sport. These were the Death Eaters, the old followers of Lord Voldemort, grown bold once more. And when the panic was at its worst, a single green shape was flung up against the stars. A vast skull with a serpent for a tongue, the Dark Mark, the sign that for 13 years no one had dared to raise. Its cold light sent a shudder through the whole of the wizarding world. When the students returned to Hogwarts, Professor Dumbledore announced that the ancient Triwizard Tournament had been revived, a contest of magic between 3 great schools. From the mountains came the students of Durmstrang, with their headmaster Karkaroff, and among them walked Krum himself. From the south, in a vast powder-blue carriage drawn by winged horses, came the students of Beauxbatons and their towering headmistress, Madame Maxime, and with them the silver-haired Fleur Delacour. To judge which champions would represent each school, a rough wooden cup was set in the entrance hall, and into its blue-white flames the hopeful dropped their names. A new teacher watched over it all, the scarred and growling Alistair Moody, brought out of retirement to teach defense, though beneath his battered face and rolling magical eye there hid, unknown to any, a very different man. On the night of the choosing, the Goblet gave up 3 names as everyone had expected. It named Cedric Diggory of Hufflepuff, tall and fair and well-loved, for Hogwarts. It named Fleur Delacour for Beauxbatons, and Victor Krum for Durmstrang. And then, when the hall had begun to settle, the flames flared red once more and spat out a 4th slip of parchment bearing a 4th name, and that name was Harry Potter. He was too young, he had not entered himself, and yet the Goblet was a binding magical contract, and so the boy was forced, bewildered and into a tournament meant for those years older than himself. Someone had placed his name there on purpose, and that someone meant for him to reach the very end. The first task set the champions against nesting dragons, and to Harry fell the fiercest of them, a Hungarian horntail. Rather than fight the creature, he summoned his broomstick to his hand and rose into the air, drawing the great beast off her clutch until he could dart down and seize the golden egg that was his prize. The second task carried them all into the black water of the lake, where each had to dive deep and recover a hostage held below by the merpeople. Harry, breathing through a slippery tangle of gillyweed, swam down into the green gloom and freed his friend Ron. And, unwilling to leave anyone behind, he freed Fleur's small sister as well, and brought them both up into the light. Between the tasks there was a night of gentler magic, the Yule Ball, with music and candlelight and dress robes, a small warm island of ordinary happiness in a year that grew darker at its edges. The third and final task was a hedge maze grown upon the Quidditch pitch, full of mist and enchantment, with the Triwizard Cup gleaming at its heart. Harry and Cedric fought their way through the twisting green corridors, and more than once each turned back to help the other, until at last they came together to the cup. Neither wished to take the glory alone, and so they agreed to grasp its handles at the same moment. But the cup had been changed into a portkey, and the instant their hands closed upon it, they were snatched away, spun through darkness, and set down in a cold and overgrown graveyard beside the ruined house on the hill. There, in that place of leaning headstones, the servant in the rat's shape was waiting, carrying a small and dreadful bundle. In one swift and merciless act, the boy Cedric was struck down, his young life put out in an instant, and Harry was bound tight against a great marble headstone. Then, the servant worked an old and terrible magic. He took a bone from the grave of the master's own father, a piece of his own flesh given willingly, and blood taken by force from the enemy who watched, and out of that steaming cauldron rose Lord Voldemort himself, whole and pale and living once more, with slit-like nostrils and eyes of red. He summoned his Death Eaters, who appeared among the graves in their masks, and bowed to him, and he told them, walking slowly through their circle, how he had fallen, and how he had returned. At last he freed Harry to duel, meaning to kill the boy before his followers and prove himself unbeatable. But when their two wands met, something strange and beautiful happened, for both had been made with a feather from the same phoenix at their core, and the twin spells refused to fight each other. A thread of golden light joined the two wands, and a shimmering dome of song rose around them, and out of the tip of Voldemort's wand came pale echoes of those he had murdered, drifting free like smoke given shape. The old man from the house, the woman he had lately slain, the boy Cedric, and, gentle and shining, Harry's own father and mother, all rose to shield him and to whisper courage. In that circle of light, Harry broke free, seized Cedric's fallen body as he had promised himself he would, and reached the portkey, and was pulled away from the graveyard back to the edge of the maze. He returned clutching a dead boy and weeping, and the joy of the watching school turned at once to horror. The false Moody drew him away, and there, in a shadowed office, the disguise at last fell apart, for the teacher was truly Barty Crouch, a devoted servant of Voldemort, who had smuggled Harry through every task to deliver him to that graveyard. He was stopped before he could finish his work. Yet the Minister for Magic refused to believe that the Dark Lord had risen, and so Dumbledore, quiet and grave in the candlelight, gathered his oldest friends to him and began, softly, to prepare for a war that most of the world was not yet willing to see. Up next in Chapter 8, The Order and the Prophecy, we'll uncover the summer of Dementors and denial, the secret house where the old fighters gathered again, and the small glass orb, hidden deep beneath the Ministry, that held the whispered words binding Harry and Voldemort together. The night in the little graveyard had ended, and the world beyond it had chosen, for a long while, not to believe what had happened there. Through the gray weeks that followed, the boy waited in the still heat of Privet Drive, listening for news that never came, watching a dry garden shimmer in the sun while the Ministry of Magic turned its face away and told itself, over and over, that the Dark Lord had not truly returned. Cornelius Fudge, who wore his lime-green bowler and his fear like a second coat, could not bear the shape of the truth, and so he let a great and famous newspaper, the Daily Prophet, paint the boy who had seen it as a confused and attention-seeking child, and Albus Dumbledore as a foolish old man long past his prime. And all the while, in the quiet, something old and steady was being gathered back together in the dark. Then, on a warm and ordinary evening, the cold came down Wisteria Walk without warning, and two Dementors slid out of the dusk toward Harry and his cousin Dudley, drawing the light and the warmth from the underpass as they came. The boy lifted his wand and called up the silver stag that lived in his happiest memories, and drove the creatures back and saved them both. Yet for that single act of defense, a letter arrived from the ministry expelling him from Hogwarts, and only Dumbledore's quiet intervention won him a hearing instead, deep in the marble bowels of the ministry, before the whole of the Wizengamot. He was cleared in the end, but he had felt, for the first time, how a frightened government could turn its heavy power upon a single truthful child. Between the hearing and the school there was a house that could not be seen. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, appeared, when it appeared at all, only by squeezing itself into being between number 11 and number 13, unfolding its dark and dusty rooms for those who already knew its secret. This was the old home of the Blacks, and now the headquarters of a hidden society, the Order of the Phoenix, first raised by Dumbledore in the earlier war, and now called quietly back into service. Beneath the shrieking portrait of an ancient screaming mother and the mounted heads of long-dead house elves, its members gathered: Sirius Black, the boy's godfather, restless and caged in his childhood home; Remus Lupin, gentle and gray and tired; Alistair Moody, whose magical eye rolled ceaselessly in his scarred face; the young witch Nymphadora Tonks, who could change her hair with a single thought; the calm, deep-voiced Kingsley Shacklebolt; and Arthur and Molly Weasley, who mothered the whole crowded house. They watched, and they listened, and they guarded something far away in the ministry that mattered more than any of them would yet say aloud. At Hogwarts, meanwhile, the denial took a human shape. Into the castle came Dolores Umbridge, a small, soft woman with a fondness for pink and for kittens on painted plates, sent by the ministry to teach a defense against the dark arts that taught nothing at all, only dry theory read aloud from a book, and to watch the school for any sign of rebellion. Slowly she gathered power to herself, decree by numbered decree, until she was named High Inquisitor and then Headmistress, banning gatherings, inspecting the teachers, and ruling with a soft and terrible smile. In her detentions, the boy was made to write lines with a cursed black quill that cut the words into the back of his own hand, so that the promise never to tell lies was scratched, again and again, into his living skin. And the more firmly she insisted that all was well, the more plainly the students came to see that it was not. So the young ones did quietly what the grown ones could not. In a room that appeared only to those who truly needed it, the room of requirement, Harry began to teach the others the real defensive magic he had learned in the hard years behind him, and they called themselves, half in jest and half in defiance, Dumbledore's Army. There, among old cushions and flickering candlelight, Neville and Luna and Ginny and dozens more raised their wands and, one by one, coaxed the first faint silver shapes of their own patronuses out of the air. It was, for a whole long season, a small warm secret kept alive in a cold and watchful castle, But the boy was not only a teacher that year, he was also a window. His scar had begun to burn and to dream, and through it he could feel the far-off moods of Lord Voldemort, joy and rage bleeding across the distance into his own sleeping mind. Dumbledore, fearing that link, would not so much as look at him, and set Severus Snape the grim task of teaching him occlumency, the closing of the mind against invasion. The lessons went badly, for there was too little trust between the two of them, and the door in the boy's mind stayed open. Through it, one deep night, he saw a great snake strike Arthur Weasley in a long dark corridor, and because the vision was true, the Order was able to reach the man in time and save his life. Yet the very same open door would soon be turned against him. For at the end of that corridor, behind a plain black curtain, lay the thing the Order had been guarding all year, deep in the Department of Mysteries. There, in a vast cold hall of prophecies, shelf upon shelf of small glowing spheres held the recorded whispers of seers, and one of them carried the boy's own name beside the name of the Dark Lord. Voldemort, unable to enter the ministry himself, wove a false and vivid vision of Sirius being tortured in that place, and the boy, loving and afraid, believed it, and rode there through the night sky with his friends to save a godfather who was never truly there. What waited instead were the Death Eaters, and a battle among the toppling shelves and the shattering glass, until the members of the Order burst in at last to fight beside the children. In the whirl of that duel, Sirius Black, laughing even as he fought his cousin Bellatrix Lestrange, was struck by a curse and fell slowly backward through the ancient stone archway and its whispering veil, and did not come out again. The boy's godfather, the one man who had offered him a home and a family, was simply gone, swallowed by a doorway that no one living could open. And when Voldemort himself appeared, and then vanished as Dumbledore arrived, and the Ministry saw at last with its own frightened eyes that the Dark Lord had returned, the grief was already done and could not be undone. Afterward, in the quiet ruin of his office, Dumbledore told the boy the thing he had carried for so many years. Long before, on a rain-washed night above a shabby inn, the seer Sybil Trelawney had spoken a true prophecy, that one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord would be born as the 7th month died, and that neither the boy nor Voldemort could live while the other still survived. So that in the end one must fall at the hand of the other. Snape had overheard only its beginning and carried those broken words to Voldemort, who had chosen the boy over another child, and, in that very choosing, marked him as his equal and made much of the prophecy come true by his own hand. It was a heavy inheritance to lay upon so young a heart, this knowledge that he alone might one day end it, or be ended. He left the school that summer heavier and quieter than he had come to it, carrying grief and a prophecy, and the sure knowledge of a war now openly begun. But even in the losing of Sirius, a thread had been drawn tight toward the truth, and the old headmaster who guarded so very many secrets had one last great secret still to share, about the enemy's own hidden and broken soul, and the long, slow, patient work that would be needed to unmake him. Up next in Chapter 9, The Half-Blood Prince and the Cave Will, the heaviness the boy carried out of that summer did not lift, but it did, in time, find quiet company, for the old headmaster came for him in person on a warm, dark night and drew him back into the slow current of the war. Albus Dumbledore, his wand hand blackened and withered by some hidden hurt he would not explain, took the boy first upon a small errand of persuasion to the borrowed armchair of a plump and cautious old wizard named Horace Slughorn, once a master of potions at Hogwarts, and now a nervous wanderer hiding from Lord Voldemort in one empty house after another. With a little flattery and the soft promise of the boy's famous company, Slughorn was coaxed out of his fear and back to the castle. And neither he nor the boy yet understood how very much would turn upon that gentle recruitment. So the 6th year began, and with Slughorn come again to teach potions, Severus Snape moved at last into the defense against the dark arts that he had long desired. In the crowded first lesson, the boy found himself without a book of his own, and took from the store cupboard an old and battered copy of Advanced Potion Making, its margins crammed from cover to cover with a stranger's small, crossed-out hand. Every recipe had been corrected and improved, every method quietly bettered, and in the front, in faded ink, its owner had named himself only as the Half-Blood Prince. Following those whispered notes as though they were a friend at his shoulder, the boy brewed as he had never brewed before, until even Slughorn beamed upon him and awarded him a tiny golden bottle of liquid luck, the potion called Felix Felicis, which for a single day would make everything a person attempted turn out well. Through that long autumn, the prince's book became a comfort and a temptation both. From its margins, the boy learned small useful charms, a spell to fill the air with a private buzzing so that no one might overhear, and a merry hex that dangled its victim by the ankle in the air, and he came to feel a strange fondness for the clever, lonely mind that had written them. Yet the same pages held a darker gift, a curse marked only as being for enemies, and in a frightened moment in a flooded bathroom, the boy would one day speak it against the pale and desperate Draco Malfoy, and open him from shoulder to hip before Snape came running to close the wounds. The prince's cleverness, the boy slowly saw, ran in more than one direction, and not all of it was kind. But the true labor of that year was not in the potions classroom. Again and again, Dumbledore called the boy up the spiral stair to his round and cluttered office, and together they bent over the shallow stone basin of the Pensiefe and sank down into borrowed memories to trace the long unmaking of a single soul. They watched the poor sad childhood of a witch named Merope Gaunt, and the handsome muggle she loved and lost, and the cold, clever orphan boy she left behind, Tom Marvolo Riddle, who even as a child had frightened other children and gathered small stolen trophies to himself. They watched that boy grow into a young man who loved fine and ancient things, who charmed and lied and murdered, and who came at last, in a memory Slughorn had hidden away in shame, to ask an old teacher a terrible question about tearing the soul into pieces. For this was the secret at the heart of it all. Lord Voldemort, in his hunger to escape death, had split his soul again and again through the act of murder, and had sealed each broken fragment inside a hidden object, a Horcrux, so that while even one of them survived, he could never truly die. Dumbledore, patient and grave, believed there were 7 such fragments, and that 2 were already destroyed. The diary that had bled its poison in the chamber years before, and a heavy gold ring, once the Gaunts, whose ruined remains had cost the headmaster the blackened and dying hand he now carried. To recover the true memory that confirmed this, Dumbledore sent the boy at last to Slughorn with his little bottle of luck, and under the warm glow of Felix Felicis, the boy drew the shameful memory gently into the open, and the shape of the enemy's long defiance of death stood clear before them. And so, on a cold night near the end of that year, the headmaster took the boy to fetch one of those hidden pieces of soul. They traveled together to a lonely stretch of cliff above a black and heaving sea, and climbed down through the spray, and swam into a fissure in the rock, and came at last through a long dark passage into a great cavern lit only by the sickly green glow of an underground lake. The far wall would not open for magic alone, for the enemy had set upon it a price of pain, and Dumbledore cut his own arm and gave his blood to the stone, and a low archway melted quietly into being. Out upon the still black water, a small ghostly boat rose at the touch of an unseen chain, sized to carry only one grown wizard, though the headmaster judged that the boy, being young and untried in the enemy's counting, might safely cross beside him. At the center of that dark lake lay a small island of smooth stone, and upon it stood a shallow basin brimming with a faintly glowing emerald potion. And beneath the potion, dim and green, lay a golden locket. The draught could not be poured away, nor parted, nor reached around. It could only be drunk to the very bottom. And so Dumbledore, gentle and unafraid, bade the boy promise to make him keep drinking whatever came, and lifted a conjured goblet to his lips. Goblet after goblet the old man swallowed, and the potion filled his mind with horror and despair, until he pleaded with unseen shapes and cried out against old and private grief, and begged for it to stop. And still the boy, weeping, tipped the dreadful stuff between his lips because he had been asked to. When the basin was empty, the locket lay bare, and the headmaster, burning now with a terrible thirst, sank down half-conscious upon the stone. There was no water but the lake, and when the boy scooped a little from its surface, the black water woke, and out of the depths rose the inferi, the pale drowned corpses that the enemy had set there to guard his treasure. Cold, dead hands closed upon the boy and dragged him toward the water, and it was Dumbledore, roused by his peril and blazing up out of his weakness, who wielded his wand and loosed a great roaring ring of fire that drove the crawling dead back into the deep. Trembling and spent, the two of them took the golden locket and crossed again in the little boat, and left that cold green cavern behind, and turned their faces toward home. Yet the locket they had bled and suffered for was not the true one at all. When at last it was opened, it held no fragment of a shattered soul, but only a small, folded scrap of parchment. A note left long before by a stranger, who signed himself with 3 initials alone. A thief who had somehow learned the enemy's secret and stolen the real Horcrux away to be destroyed, and who wrote only that he expected to be dead by the time it was read. Somewhere in the world the true locket was hidden, and the patient work of unmaking Lord Voldemort, so nearly begun, stood suddenly further off than ever, waiting in the dark for hands that did not yet know where to look. Up next in Chapter 10. The long wandering in the cold wheel, when the greatest of wizards had fallen from the high tower and the white marble tomb had closed over him beside the still gray waters of the lake, the boy who was left behind came slowly to understand that his school days were over. He would not return to the castle in the autumn as the other children would. In their place he had set himself a long and secret errand to seek out the hidden fragments of Lord Voldemort's broken soul, those dark and cunning vessels that were called Horcruxes, for only when every one of them had been unmade could the Dark Lord himself at last be brought to his ending. And so, as that heavy summer deepened, the plans of quieter and braver people turned all about the task of moving one boy safely from one house to another, that the long hunt might begin. The danger was very great, for the Ministry of Magic was crumbling from within, and the old enchantment that had guarded Harry at his aunt and uncle's house would fail on the very night he came of age. To carry him away unseen, 6 of his friends drank a measure of the transforming polyjuice potion and took upon themselves his own shape, so that 7 identical figures of Harry rose into the night sky, each beside a chosen guardian, scattering in 7 directions to confound the watchers. But the enemy had somehow learned of the flight, and the dark air filled with hooded riders and streaks of green light. Harry's wand seemed to act of its own accord that night, loosing a strange golden fire at the pale, pursuing shape of Voldemort himself. Yet the cost was cruel. The faithful snowy owl Hedwig was struck down, and the old and battle-worn Alistair Moody was killed and fell from the sky, and one of the Weasley twins lost an ear to a curse meant for something far worse. Harry reached a distant refuge at last, shaken and grieving, and one by one the others limped home to be counted. They had come to the Burrow, the crooked and beloved home of the Weasley family, and there for a little while the world grew gentle again, for a wedding was being made ready. Bill, the eldest of the Weasley sons, was to marry the silver-haired Fleur Delacour, and a great pale marquee was raised in the orchard, and rows of golden chairs were set out upon the grass beneath the soft summer stars. For one long warm evening there was music and candlelight and slow dancing, a small bright island of ordinary happiness in a darkening year. But even as the guests turned and swayed, a shining silver shape came gliding down among them, the lynx that was the messenger of Kingsley Shacklebolt, and it spoke with his grave, slow voice the news that the ministry had fallen, that the old minister was dead, and that the enemy was coming even now. The music faltered, the lights guttered low, and in the sudden confusion, Harry, Ron, and Hermione took one another by the hand and turned upon the spot and were gone. They came down in a busy Muggle street in the heart of London, and there, in a small late-night cafe, 2 Death Eaters found them, and a swift and frightening struggle followed, until the 3 friends slipped away once more and made for the one refuge left to them. This was number 12, Grimmauld Place, the tall and gloomy old house of the ancient family of Black, which Harry had lately come to own. Its rooms were dusty and full of shadows, its portraits muttered upon the walls, and a cursed image of the dead headmaster rose from the hall carpet to test whoever entered. Yet the house was hidden by deep and stubborn magic and would hold them for a time. There, in that dim and whispering place, a long-buried secret began to unfold. Among Harry's few clues was a heavy golden locket taken from a hidden cave beyond the sea, which had been believed to hold a piece of Voldemort's soul, and yet it had proved to be false, a hollow counterfeit that held only a small folded note signed with 3 initials, an R and an A and a B. Slowly the meaning came clear. The letters belonged to Regulus Arcturus Black, a younger son of that very house, once a follower of the Dark Lord, who had turned against his master in secret. It was the aged house elf creature who told the tale, in his cracked and sorrowful way, of how Regulus had been lent to Voldemort, and had learned the true and terrible purpose of the real locket, and how he had gone back into the cave to steal it away, and had given his life in the doing, commanding the little elf to destroy the thing and to tell no one. Creature had tried and failed, and had carried the sorrow of it silently for many long years. When Harry spoke to the small creature with kindness and gave into his keeping the false locket that had once been Regulus's own, the old elf's long bitterness melted away into devotion, and so creature revealed the final thread of the story, that the real locket had been stolen out of the house by a sly and shabby thief named Mundungus Fletcher. At Harry's gentle bidding the elf went hunting, and returned at last dragging the thief before them, and the thief confessed that he had given the locket away as a bribe, into the grasping hands of a cruel woman in a pink cardigan, who sat deep within the ministry, Dolores Umbridge. So the three friends laid a bold and dangerous plan. Wearing the borrowed faces of three ministry workers, drawn once more from the potion, they walked in through the very doors of the enemy's stronghold, now a cold place of black marble, where a great statue proclaimed that magic was might and crushed the figures of ordinary folk beneath it. In its lower courts, the frightened and the innocent were being questioned about the blood in their veins. And there sat Umbridge in judgment, the stolen locket gleaming at her throat. The friends snatched it from her, set free those she had condemned, and fled up through the crowded halls as the alarm was raised. In the last desperate moment of their escape, a Death Eater seized hold of Hermione as she turned to disapparate, and to shake him loose, she carried them not back to Grimmauld Place, which was now betrayed, but away into the empty countryside. Ron was torn and hurt in the leaving, splinched by the frantic magic, and the old house was lost to them forever. And so began the long wandering in the cold. With nowhere safe left in all the world, the three moved from place to place across the wild and lonely heart of Britain, pitching a small enchanted tent in silent woods and upon wind-bitten moors and beside slow dark rivers, folding it away again each gray dawn to move on before they could be found. Hermione had packed a great many useful things into one small beaded bag, and she wove strong charms of concealment about their camp each night, so that no eye and no ear from the outer world could reach them. Yet they had no clear path before them, only the knowledge that more Horcruxes lay hidden somewhere beneath the sky, and no notion at all of where to seek them, or how such fell things might be broken once found. The days grew shorter, and the nights grew colder. Their food grew thin, and the golden locket, being itself one of the very things they hunted, was far too dangerous to leave lying about, and so they wore it in turn upon a chain about the neck. And little by little, as it lay against each beating heart, it began to breathe its cold and heavy influence into their weary thoughts. Up next in Chapter 11, The Locket's Weight and the Empty Chair, we'll uncover how the dark thing soured their days and set friend against friend, how a slow hunger and a creeping hopelessness stole into the tent, and how one of the three, worn down at last, would turn away into the night and leave a place beside the fire standing empty. And so the three of them drifted on through that gray and shortening autumn, from one lonely fold of the countryside to another, pitching the small enchanted tent at the edges of woods and upon windswept moors, and in the shelter of quiet hillsides, where no ordinary eye would ever find them. Each new place looked much like the last, and each night folded softly into the next with the same slow sameness, so that the days lost their names and blurred into one long gray ribbon of cold. But of all the burdens they carried through that wandering, of all the hunger and the damp and the endless not knowing where next to turn, the heaviest by far was a very small golden thing that hung upon a chain, the locket of Salazar Slytherin, that broken fragment of an enemy's soul which they had wrested at last from the very heart of the ministry. They had agreed, though none of them ever quite decided it aloud, that no single one of them should bear it alone for long. And so they took it in turns, each wearing the locket against the bare skin for a stretch of hours before passing it gently to the next, as though it were a slow sickness that must be shared out fairly, so that no one of them should be wholly consumed by it. But the thing was patient, and it was cruel, and it seemed somehow to know the softest and most secret places in a person, and it pressed upon them there with a cold and quiet weight. When Harry wore it, his own thoughts grew slow and dark, and the tent felt colder than it was, and hope thinned away to almost nothing at all. When Hermione wore it, her clever and busy mind turned inward and began to gnaw upon itself, and she would sit long and silent over her books with her brow drawn tight. But it was upon Ron that the locket lay heaviest of all, for Ron had a warm and loyal heart and a great and simple love of home. And the locket found that love in him and set about turning it patiently into fear. It whispered to him, or seemed to whisper, of everything he had left behind, of the mother and the father and the many brothers, and the one red-haired sister he could no longer stand between, and any harm. And it fed and fattened every worry he owned, until he could scarcely think past the shadow of them, for the Weasleys were known blood traitors now, open friends to Harry Potter, and the price of such friendship in so dark a time was a terrible thing to hold in the mind. Ron had covered his tracks with care before he slipped away from home, letting it be given out that he lay ill in his bed at the Burrow, struck down with the spattergroit and too contagious to be seen, so that his absence at Harry's side might never once be guessed. Yet a family ghoul dressed up in pajamas and shut away in an attic was a very thin shield against a darkness so wide, and the not knowing wore upon him, night after slow night. Their days settled into small and threadbare rituals. Hermione's little beaded bag held far more than any bag its size had any right to hold, and out of it came the folding chairs and the books and the few provisions they had. But those provisions dwindled, and hunger became a steady and gnawing companion, so that at times, when it grew too sharp to bear, one of them would slip out beneath the old silvery cloak into a sleeping village to take a little bread from a shop or a few eggs from a henhouse, leaving a scattering of coins behind where they could. In quieter hours, Harry would draw out the worn parchment of the old map his father's friends had made and watch for one small dot bearing a name he loved, moving alone through the far corridors of the distant castle. And that single moving speck of ink was very nearly the only comfort he had. And more, in the dead of night, his scar would burn, and his vision would slip away from the tent altogether, off across the world, to where the enemy himself hunted for something Harry could not yet name, some old maker of wands in a foreign land. The locket wore them all thinner, and the arguments came more often, small and sour and hard to stop. And then, upon one bitter night, it broke them. Ron had worn the locket the whole of that long day, and he was hungry, and the half-healed wound in his arm still ached where he had been splinched in their flight, and the fear for his family sat heavy on him like a stone. Something in him gave way at last, and he turned upon Harry, and out of him poured all the disappointment he had held back for weeks. The bitter sense that there was no plan and no path, that they wandered in circles in the cold with no idea how to find the other pieces of the enemy's soul, still less how to destroy the one they already carried. Harry, stung, gave it back to him, and Hermione stood between them, with tears standing in her eyes, trying and failing to soothe the two people she loved most in the world. And then Ron asked the question that could not be unasked, whether Hermione would leave with him now or whether she would stay. When she chose, weeping, to remain at Harry's side, something inside Ron seemed to close like a shutter. He wrenched the golden locket from about his neck and cast it down upon a chair, and he turned, and he walked out into the wind and the rain, and with a sharp crack of disapparition, the darkness swallowed him whole. Hermione flew out after him into the storm, crying a name that the wind tore away and carried off unheard, and when she came back at last, she was soaked through and shaking, and she could not stop the weeping for a very long while. In the gray days that followed, the small folding chair, where the third of them had always sat, stayed empty beside the little fire, and neither of the two who remained could quite bear to look at it. Hermione took upon herself alone the casting of the protective enchantments each dusk, walking the circle of the camp with her wand and her thick and steady voice, weaving them safe against the night. And Harry took to wearing the cold locket almost without pause now, to spare her the weight of it, so that its chill settled into him like a second and quieter grief. They folded the tent the next morning and moved on, and folded it again the morning after that, drifting ever further into the wild, and the emptiness traveled with them wherever they went, a silent third where a friend had been. Yet grief has a strange way of turning at last toward home. In the long hush that came after Ron's leaving, a longing began to grow in Harry, faint at first and then steadier by the day, to go at last to the one place in all the world he had never seen and had always half belonged to. The small village where he had been born and where his mother and father had been laid to rest. The place where all of it had begun on a long ago Halloween night. He came to believe, or perhaps only to hope, that the old headmaster might have left the silver sword of Gryffindor hidden there in the keeping of a trusted friend, and that answers of some kind might be waiting quietly among the graves. Hermione, worn and wary, was slow and fearful to agree, for surely it was a place their enemies would think to watch. But the pull of it grew, gentle and insistent, and their tired feet began at last to turn that way. Up next in Chapter 12, Godric's Hollow and the Tale of Three Brothers, Will, with the empty chair still cold beside their small fire, and their friend gone into the dark and the rain. The two who remained went on together in the hush of that long winter, and slowly, without ever quite deciding it aloud, they turned their weary steps toward the one place that had always been waiting for the boy at the far edge of his mourning. On the still night of Christmas Eve, wrapped beneath the old invisibility cloak and holding tightly to one another, Harry and Hermione slipped into the sleeping village of Godric's Hollow, where soft snow lay untouched upon the lane and gold light spilled from the windows of a little church, and from within came the gentle, rising music of a carol that seemed to belong to another and kinder world. They walked among the graves of that quiet churchyard, their breath clouding in the frozen air, and the snow deepened around the leaning stones. There Hermione found a very old grave marked with the name of Ignotus Peverell, and carved upon it, worn nearly smooth by centuries of wind and rain, a strange small sign, a triangle enclosing a circle that was crossed through the middle by a single straight line, a mark that Harry did not yet understand, but which would come to shape all that followed. A little further on, they found the resting place of Kendra Dumbledore and her daughter Ariana, gone from the world too young, and Harry felt the faint far echo of a family whose story was more tangled than he knew. And then, in the oldest and snowiest corner, they came at last upon a stone of white marble, and there were written the names of James Potter and Lily Potter, and the dates that told how very briefly they had lived, and beneath the names a gentle promise carved into the marble that the last enemy to be destroyed would be death itself. Hermione conjured a wreath of winter roses and laid it softly upon the grave, and the boy stood a long while in the falling snow, saying nothing, only remembering the parents he had never truly known. As they turned back toward the sleeping street, they became aware of a bent and muffled figure watching them from the churchyard gate, an old woman swathed in shawls who beckoned to them without a word and shuffled away into the shadows, and something in Harry told him that she knew who he was. They followed her past a broken little cottage half hidden behind a wild hedge. The very house where he had once lived, its upper floor blasted open to the sky and left so for 16 years as a monument, its garden sign grown thick with the scratched and glowing messages of strangers who had come to bless the boy who lived. The old woman led them on to her own dark house, and up a narrow stair, and there, in a foul and cluttered room, the truth uncoiled itself. For the woman was not Bathilda Bagshot, the aged historian, at all, but only her poor dead body worn as a disguise, and out of the ruin of it came the great serpent Nagini, sent by the Dark Lord to lie in wait. The snake struck and coiled, and in the chaos Hermione's spell blasted them free, though the same wild blast broke Harry's wand nearly in two, and they turned upon the spot and vanished into the night, just as Voldemort himself came shrieking down through the dark, arriving one heartbeat too late, and Harry felt again, in a searing flash, the memory of the night his mother had died to save him. The days that came after were the hardest of all, for the boy had lost his wand and much of his hope, and the black locket they still could not destroy hung its cold weight upon whoever wore it, whispering its poison into their hearts. Yet in the deepest cold of that despair, a silver doe of light came walking through a snowbound forest and led Harry to a frozen pool where the true sword of Godric Gryffindor waited beneath the ice, and there, at the very edge of drowning. The friend who had left them returned out of the darkness to pull him free. Together they drew the sword from the water, and with it, Ron struck the locket open and destroyed the fragment of soul that had tormented them so long, and something broken between the three of them was quietly mended. Reunited and a little healed, they turned their minds again to the mark upon the old grave and the questions it had woken, and so they went to seek the one man who might explain it, the dreamy and gentle father of Luna Lovegood, who lived in a strange black tower beyond the hills. Xenophilius Lovegood wore that same triangular sign upon a chain about his neck, and when they asked him what it meant, he told them, in his soft and wandering way, an old story that wizarding children heard at bedtime, the fable of the three brothers, and as he told it, the tale unfolded like something remembered from the very edge of sleep. Long ago, he said, 3 brothers were traveling at twilight along a lonely road, and they came to a river too deep and dangerous to cross, until the eldest, being clever, waved his wand and made a bridge of stone rise up over the rushing water. But halfway across they met a hooded figure standing in their path, and it was Death himself, cheated of 3 travelers who ought by rights to have drowned. And cunning Death, hiding his anger, praised their skill and offered each brother a gift of his choosing. The eldest brother, who was a proud and combative man, asked for a wand more powerful than any in existence, a wand that must always win its master every duel, and Death cut such a wand from an elder tree that grew upon the riverbank and gave it into his hand. The second brother, who was an arrogant man, wished to humble Death still further and asked for the power to call back others from beyond the grave, and Death picked up a small stone from the river and gave it to him, telling him it had the power to raise the dead. And the third and youngest brother, who was the humblest and the wisest of the 3, did not trust Death at all, and asked instead for something that would let him leave that place without being followed. And so Death, most unwilling, handed over his own cloak of invisibility. Then the 3 brothers parted and went on their separate ways. The eldest traveled to a distant village and boasted of his unbeatable wand, and that very night a rival crept in and cut his throat as he slept and stole the wand away, and so Death took the first brother for his own. The second brother went home and turned the little stone thrice in his hand, and there before him rose the shade of the girl he had once hoped to marry, yet she was cold and sorrowful, and did not truly belong among the living, and mad with hopeless longing he took his own life to join her. And so, Death took the second brother too, but the youngest brother Death could never find. For he wore the cloak, and kept himself hidden through all the long years of a full and gentle life. And only when he was very old did he at last take off the cloak and give it to his own son, and then he greeted Death as an old friend, and went with him gladly, as equals, departing this life in peace. Those 3 gifts, Xenophilius told them, were the deathly Hallows, the elder wand that cannot be beaten, the resurrection stone that calls back the dead, and the cloak of invisibility that hides its wearer even from death. And the wizard who gathered all 3 and truly understood them would become the master of death. Harry sat very still as the old tale settled over him, for he wore his own father's cloak upon his shoulders, and had seen that same 3-cornered sign carved upon the grave of Ignotus Peverell, and a slow and quiet wonder was beginning to grow in him, even as the shadows outside the Black Tower thickened and drew near. Up next in Chapter 13, Captured at Malfoy Manor, Will. The forest grew quieter still after Xenophilius Lovegood's crooked house, quieter after the old tale of the 3 brothers, and the 3 young travelers moved on into the deep of the winter, with the newborn knowledge of the deathly Hallows resting beside the older, heavier weight of the Horcruxes they had not yet found. They pitched their small, enchanted tent wherever the land would hide them, and each night they laid the familiar charms about it, the shielding and the silencing, and the spells that turned an unfriendly gaze gently aside. For a long while those charms held, and the cold nights passed one into another with nothing worse in them than hunger and doubt and the slow ache of a burden too large for 3 children to carry alone. But there was one word they should never have spoken aloud, and one weary night, wrapped in low talk of the enemy, Harry let the name of Lord Voldemort fall from his lips, as he had always done. What none of them yet knew was that the name had been laid under a cruel jinx, a taboo, so that any who dared to speak it tore open at once the protection around them and rang, far away in the dark, like a bell in the ears of those who hunted. Within moments the night beyond the canvas, filled with footsteps and swinging lamplight and rough laughter, and a band of snatchers, the ragged bounty men who now prowled the countryside for the Muggle-born and the wanted, came closing in about the place where the 3 of them stood. In the last breath before they were seized, Hermione turned her wand upon Harry himself and struck him with a stinging jinx, so that his face swelled and reddened and grew strange, hiding the famous scar and the well-known features beneath a puffed and shapeless mask. It was a small mercy of quick thinking, and it very nearly saved them all. The snatchers dragged the 3 into the lamplight, led by the great filthy shape of Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf who hungered even out of the moon, and by the sly and drawling Scabior, who thought himself clever. They searched the little party roughly, turning out Hermione's beaded bag, and among its endless hidden depths they drew forth the gleaming silver blade of the sword of Gryffindor, its rubies bright even in that poor light. The captured children gave what false names they could. Ron named himself as one Stan Shunpike, then stumbled and offered another, and Harry, through his thickened lips, called himself Vernon Dudley, hoping the disguise would hold. But the snatchers had a torn page bearing Hermione's true face, marked as a friend of the boy they most wished to find, and though they could not be certain of the swollen creature beside her, greed and suspicion together decided them. They would not settle for a common bounty. They would carry these 3, sword and all, to the one house where such a prize might best be judged, and so they gripped their prisoners and turned them south, toward the tall dark gates and the long gravel drive of Malfoy Manor. The manor rose cold and grand out of the winter dusk, its hedges black, its many windows dim, and within its pale and echoing drawing room, the remnants of a proud family waited under the shadow of their master's occupation. There the pale boy Draco Malfoy was called forward and made to look closely upon the swollen face, to say whether or not it truly belonged to Harry Potter. He looked, and he hesitated, and something in him would not quite speak the certain word, so that he named neither yes nor no, and left the matter hanging. It might all have ended in that uncertainty, had another eye not fallen upon the sword. For Bellatrix Lestrange, dark and wild, and devoted past all reason to the Dark Lord, saw the blade of Gryffindor laid upon the table and was seized by a sudden white terror. That sword, she believed, lay safe and deep within her own vault at Gringotts, locked among her most guarded treasures. And if it was here in a snatcher's hand, then something she was sworn to protect might already be lost. In her fear, she drove the rough bounty men from the room and turned her cruelty upon Hermione, questioning her again and again over how the sword had come to them and where else they had been. When words would not come quickly enough, she used the Cruciatus curse, and worse, cutting a cruel word for those of Muggle birth into the soft flesh of the girl's arm, so that Hermione's cries rose thin and terrible through the great house, while Harry and Ron were forced away below. They were thrust down into the cellar, into a cold stone dark that was not empty. There, waiting in the gloom, were others the war had swallowed: Luna Lovegood, gentle and unbroken; Mist Ollivander, the old wandmaker, thin and gray with long captivity; Dean Thomas, a schoolfellow lost from sight; and Griphook, a goblin of Gringotts who knew more of vaults and blades than any of them guessed. In that huddled company, with Hermione's pain sounding faintly overhead, Harry drew from his pocket the broken shard of an old mirror that had once belonged to Sirius, and in its fragment he glimpsed a flash of a bright blue eye, watching, before it was gone. He did not understand it, and yet he called out into the dark for help, half in prayer and half in desperation, and the dark answered. With a sharp crack there appeared among them Dobby, the free house elf, the small and loyal creature Harry had freed years before, sent to that cellar by the very eye in the glass. Quietly the elf began the rescue, spiriting away first Luna and Dean and old Ollivander to safety far off, then returning for the rest. But Wormtail, the traitor Peter Pettigrew, came down to see what stirred below, and in the struggle that followed Harry reminded him, without meaning to, of the one small mercy he had once been shown. For a single instant the little man hesitated, and his own silver hand, the gift his master had made him, turned against its owner and closed about his throat, so that the betrayer was undone by the price of his own broken debt. Above, Bellatrix at last summoned Griphook to say whether the sword upon her table was the true blade or a counterfeit, and the goblin, for reasons of his own, looked upon it and named it false. A copy, nothing to fear. It was a lie that bought the prisoners their lives, and in the moment it was spoken, Dobby seized his chance and caught Harry and Ron and the freed Hermione, turning on the spot to bear them away. But as the darkness folded around them, Bellatrix flung her silver knife across the room after the vanishing elf, and the blade found him even as he passed out of the world of the manor. They landed hard upon a windswept shore before a small white house among the dunes, the home of Bill and Fleur that men called Shell Cottage, safe at last beyond the reach of the enemy. Yet Dobby had been struck through, and there upon the cold sand the little elf slipped away in Harry's arms, unafraid. having given his freedom and his life for people he loved. And Harry, who had lost so much already, dug the grave himself by hand, without a single stroke of magic, laying the small brave body deep in the earth and marking above it a plain stone that named him for what he had chosen to be, a free elf, here at last laid to rest. In the grief of that digging, something quiet and resolved settled over the boy, a new and steadier purpose, for he had glimpsed at last the shape of the road ahead, and it led back to the very vault whose secret had so terrified Bellatrix Lestrange. Up next in Chapter 14, A Dragon and a Vault of Gold, the escape from Malfoy Manor had ended on a windswept stretch of coast, where a small stone house called Shell Cottage stood with its back to the wide gray sea. And there, in a garden above the water, the boy had dug a grave with his own hands for the little elf who had died to save them. Dobby was laid to rest beneath the salt wind with no magic and no spell, only the slow work of a spade and the quiet grief of those who had loved him. And in the raw ache of those days, the boy came, at last, to a kind of certain calm. He had glimpsed, in the moment of his own capture, the pale gleam of a golden cup in the mind of Bellatrix Lestrange, and he understood now, more surely than ever, where the next fragment of the enemy's broken soul lay hidden. For the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, one of the 4 founders of the school, had been given by Voldemort into the keeping of his most devoted follower, and Bellatrix, proud and cruel and endlessly loyal, had shut it away in the deepest and most guarded place she knew, the family vault far beneath the marble halls of Gringotts, the wizarding bank run by the goblins in the heart of Diagon Alley. To reach it would mean breaking into a fortress that had never truly been robbed, sunk deep in the living rock beneath London, and for that the 3 friends needed a guide who knew its winding ways. In the cottage there rested such a guide, a goblin named Griphook, who had also been carried out of the cellar of the manor, sullen and clever and watchful, nursing his own long grievances against the wizards who had ruled the bank for so many years. So a bargain was struck, slowly and warily, over many quiet conversations by candlelight. The goblin would lead them down into the bank and help them win their way into the Lestrange vault, and in return the boy promised him the one thing his heart most desired, the silver sword of Godric Gryffindor, its blade set with rubies and made pure by the venom of a basilisk. It was a hard promise to make, for that same sword was the only weapon they had that could destroy the very treasure they were hunting. Yet the boy made it, meaning in his heart to hold the blade a little longer than the goblin knew, and that small hidden dishonesty would come, in time, to cost them dearly. The plan they wove together was a delicate and dangerous thing. Hermione would drink the thick transforming polyjuice potion and take upon herself the very face and shape of Bellatrix Lestrange, wearing a strand of the Dark Witch's own hair, so that she might walk into the bank as one of its most feared and honored customers. Ron was disguised too, his features altered and hidden behind a thick beard, made over into a foreign wizard who spoke little and kept to the shadows, playing the part of the great lady's silent escort. And the boy himself, together with the goblin clinging to his back, would move unseen beneath the soft silver folds of the invisibility cloak, the last of the 3 deathly Hallows that fate had woven into his family, watching and waiting for the moment to act. Diagon Alley, when they came to it, was not the bright and bustling lane the boy remembered from his childhood. The color had drained out of it in the long shadow of the war, the shop fronts shuttered and boarded, the windows papered over with the frightened notices of the new order, and beggars huddled in the doorways where once there had been laughter. Into that cold and watchful street the false Bellatrix walked with a haughty, gliding step, and the disguise held even when a true Death Eater named Travers approached them, suspicious and probing, so that the boy beneath the cloak was forced at last to lift his wand and lay the imperious curse gently upon the man's mind, guiding him like a puppet away from doubt and toward obedience. Down in the cool marble hall of the bank, the goblins behind their high desks did not bow as they once had done, for they no longer trusted the face of Bellatrix without proof, and they asked for her true wand to test the truth of her. The boy, hidden and swift, turned the same soft curse upon the goblin teller Bogrod, so that the creature's eyes went blank and pliant, and the little company was led away from the hall and down toward the vaults. They climbed into a rattling cart that plunged along its narrow track, deeper and deeper through the dark stone tunnels of the underworld, past stalactites and hidden falls, until they came upon a cunning defense the goblins had raised in secret, a wide waterfall the goblins called the Thief's Downfall, whose enchanted waters washed away every spell and disguise from any who passed through them. The cart tipped them out, and the falling water stripped Hermione back into her own trembling shape and rinsed the false beard from Ron and lifted the curse from the goblin's clouded mind, so that in one drenched and desperate instant the guise was gone, and they stood revealed as thieves in the heart of the bank. And there before them, chained at the foot of the deepest tunnels, lay the last and most terrible of the guardians, a great dragon of the breed called the Ukrainian Ironbelly, its scales gone pale and its eyes gone milky and blind from the endless dark, its wretched flesh scarred where the goblins had taught it, over cruel years, to shrink and cower whenever it heard the clash of the small iron instruments they carried, expecting always the coming of pain. Past that suffering beast they crept, and the goblin pressed his palm to the enchanted door of the Lestrange vault, so that the metal melted away like mist. And inside, they found a treasure more dangerous than any hoard of ordinary gold, for every object heaped within had been laid under two dark enchantments together, so that whatever they touched burned their skin with searing heat and multiplied itself endlessly, spilling into a rising flood of scalding copies that threatened to bury them alive. High upon a shelf, far above their reach, the small golden cup gleamed with its badger stamped upon the side, and by lifting the boy on a hovering charm and reaching up with the point of Gryffindor's sword, they hooked it down at last into their keeping, even as the molten treasure rose about their ankles. But the goblin had watched the sword with hungry eyes through all of it, and in the chaos of that burning vault, he seized the blade for himself, snatched it from the boy's grasp, and slipped away into the tunnels, crying out to the guards that thieves had come, keeping his half of the bargain in the letter and betraying it in the spirit. Trapped now, hunted, clutching the cup that scalded his hands, the boy did the only wild thing left to them. They fought their way to the blind and shackled dragon, cut it loose from the chains that had held it so long, and climbed upon its ridged and armored back, and the great creature, sensing freedom for the first time in its long imprisonment, tore upward through the tunnels and the mighty domed roof of the bank, and burst out over the rooftops of London into open sky. For a long while they clung to its cold spine as it flew north over fields and forests, until they judged it had wandered far enough from any watching eye, and they let themselves slide from its back and drop down into the cool waters of a green lake far below. Soaked and shaking on the shore, they held the cup between them, 3 Horcruxes, now destroyed, or in their hands, and the enemy's soul grown thinner. Yet even in that small triumph the boy's scar seared white with the fury of a mind far away. For Voldemort had learned of the theft and understood at once, with a rising and terrible dread, that his hidden treasures were being hunted one by one. Up next in Chapter 15, the return to a waiting castle, Will. The dragon carried them a long way from the marble halls of Gringotts, over the rooftops and the shining river, higher than the chimneys and the crooked spires, until London slipped away behind them and the green country opened wide and quiet below. For a while, the three of them clung to the ridged and battered back of the beast, wind scoured and soaked and half-blind, and they let the great half-starved creature choose its own slow northward road, for it had known nothing but darkness for so very long that even the gray daylight seemed to bewilder it. When at last it dipped toward the silver gleam of a lake cupped among wooded hills, they judged the water near enough and the moment as good as any, and one after another they loosened their grip and fell, dropping through the cold air into colder water, and swam for the shore while the dragon flew on, free and unknowing, into a sky it had not seen in more years than any of them could count. They dragged themselves onto the muddy bank and lay there a moment, breathing hard, clutching the small golden cup that had cost them so much to win. And there was no rest in it at all. For Harry felt his scar burn as it had not burned in weeks, and rather than close his mind against it, as he had trained himself so long to do, he chose this once to let the door swing open and to look through the enemy's own eyes. What he saw there was a rage beyond anything, a white and boundless fury as Voldemort learned that his vault had been breached, that the goblins had been tricked, that one of the precious anchors of his splintered soul had been carried out of the deepest place he had thought safe. In that terrible clarity, Harry understood two things at once. He understood that Voldemort now knew his secret, that his enemy was hunting the fragments of his soul, one by one. And he understood, with a certainty that came from inside Voldemort's own panic, that another such fragment lay hidden within the walls of Hogwarts, in the one place the friendless boy who had grown into a monster had ever truly loved. There was little that could be said, and less that needed saying. They knew now that Voldemort would go to the school to be sure his treasure was safe, and they knew they had to reach it first. The thing hidden there belonged, they were nearly certain, to Rowena Ravenclaw, some lost and honored relic of the founder whose house prized wit and learning, though what shape it took, and where within that vast and shifting castle it might rest, they could not yet say. And so, wet and shivering, and out of every other plan, they turned their thoughts toward Hogsmeade, the little village that crouched in the shadow of the school, and Hermione gathered them close beneath the shelter of a spinney, and with a turn on the spot the three of them vanished from the lakeside and were gone. They arrived in a dark and narrow alley behind the village, and in the same breath a shriek tore through the night, a rising, wailing screech that seemed to come from the very air and would not stop. It was a caterwauling charm, laid over the whole of Hogsmeade by those who now held it, and the sound of it brought doors slamming and cloaked figures spilling into the frozen street. Death Eaters moved between the buildings, and behind them came a deeper cold, a creeping, soul-deep chill that drained the warmth from the world, for Dementors glided down the lane with the dead leaves. Harry felt the old despair reaching for him, and though every instinct of a hunted year warned against it, he raised his wand and thought of everything he had ever loved, and a great silver stag burst from the tip and drove the cold things back. It was a light that any who knew him would know at once, a beacon in the Black Street naming him more surely than any shout could have done. Then a door opened in the wall beside them, a mean little door in the side of an inn, and a rough voice bid them inside, and they tumbled through into the dim and dingy taproom of the Hog's Head. The man who had saved them was old and gray and ill-tempered, with a long tangled beard and a pair of piercing blue eyes that Harry felt with a strange jolt he had seen somewhere before. When the Death Eaters hammered at the door demanding whose Patronus had shone in the street, the old man met them at the threshold and turned them away with the sour claim that he had cast the stag himself and that they might mind their own business, and grumbling, they went. Only then did he tell the three who he was. He was Aberforth Dumbledore, brother to the great Albus, the last of that family still living, and it was he who kept this crooked inn beneath the castle he would not enter. By the fire he tried to talk them out of the whole desperate business, urging them to flee through the mountains while there was still a road out, and when Harry would not be moved, the old man's bitterness broke loose, and out came at last the sad and buried history of his house. He told of a little sister named Ariana, harmed as a small child by cruel village boys who had seen her doing magic and been frightened by it, so that her power turned inward and unstable and could not be controlled. He told of a father sent to Azkaban for avenging her and dying there, and of a mother who hid the child away and was herself killed by one of the girl's uncontrolled bursts of magic. He told of how the brilliant elder brother, left to keep the family, had fallen under the spell of a golden-haired young man named Gellert Grindelwald, and how the two of them had dreamed together of power and of a new order, until a bitter quarrel rose between the three young men and spilled into a duel, and in the chaos of that duel, the gentle sister had fallen, and none of them ever knew whose curse it was that struck her down. Over the mantel of the shabby room there hung a portrait of that lost girl, painted in soft and living colors, a fair child who watched them with quiet, patient eyes. Harry told the old man that he trusted his brother still, that Albus had left him a task, and he meant to finish it, and something in that steadfastness seemed to settle the argument at last. The old man looked long at the portrait of his sister, and the painted girl turned and walked away down a long tunnel that opened somehow within the frame, growing smaller and smaller until she was lost to sight. They waited in the firelight, and after a while she returned, and she was not alone, for beside her walked a real and living figure, coming nearer along the hidden passage, and when the portrait swung open like a little door in the wall, the one who climbed out was Neville Longbottom, battered and bruised and grinning through a split lip, harder and older than the boy they had known. He had come through a secret way that ran from behind the painting all the way to a room within the castle itself, a passage grown into being in this darkest year to shelter those who still resisted. He led them into the low stone tunnel, and they walked it a long time, up and up beneath the sleeping hills, until it ended in a plain door, and beyond that door was the room of requirement, and it was full of hammocks and lamplight and the pale, waiting faces of every friend they had thought lost. So it was that Harry Potter came home at last to the castle that had waited for him, and every heart in that hidden room lifted, for they understood, without a word spoken, that the boy had returned because the ending had finally come. Up next in Chapter 16, the Battle of Hogwarts begins. Will. The castle had woken all at once, and Severus Snape had gone from it like a shadow blown out of a broken window, driven off into the darkness by Minerva McGonagall's silver fire, and for a single held breath the whole of Hogwarts stood balanced between one war and the next, quiet and trembling and listening. Then, into that fragile quiet, came a voice that belonged to no throat in the building, a high cold whisper that seemed to rise out of the very stones and to slide into every ear at once, so that students and teachers alike felt it move along their skin. It was the voice of Lord Voldemort, and it laid before them a single cold bargain, that if they would only give up the boy called Harry Potter before the deep stroke of midnight, the school would be spared, and the Dark Lord and all his followers would withdraw. Until then, the voice said, they had only the short hours of the night in which to decide. For a moment, no one moved, and in the wide silver hush of the great hall, a girl of Slytherin named Pansy Parkinson lifted a shaking arm and cried out that the boy was there among them, that someone should seize him and be done. But before the sound had even settled, the students of the other houses rose to their feet as one and turned, not toward Harry, but toward her, wands lifted in his defense, so that the frightened girl and her house were quietly parted from the rest and led away first, down through the passages toward safety. And Minerva McGonagall, tall and gray and utterly unafraid, took command of a castle that had waited a long and bitter year for someone to tell it at last to fight. The evacuation moved like a slow tide. The very young and the unwilling were shepherded out through a hidden tunnel that opened, far away, in the dusty back room of the Hog's Head, where old Aberforth Dumbledore stood at his hearth and lifted child after child up into the Hogsmeade night. And those of age who chose to stay turned their hands to the strange work of making a school into a fortress. High upon the battlements and along the ancient stone bridges, the teachers raised their wands together and wove a great dome of protection over the whole of Hogwarts. Layer upon shimmering layer, the shield charms and the binding charms and the charms that turn an enemy away, until the towers seemed wrapped in a faint and trembling light. Phileas Flitwick, small and fierce, sang the enchantments high into the air. Pomona Sprout carried up her most dangerous plants to loose upon the heads of those below. Horace Slughorn, who had run and hidden for so long, came back at the last with reinforcements at his heel. And then Minerva McGonagall did a thing she had waited her whole long life to do, and spoke the old command Purtatum Locomotor, so that all through the castle the suits of armor and the carved stone knights and the great sentinel statues shuddered and stepped down from their pedestals and marched past her in a thunder of stone feet. She sent them down like a shepherd, sending out a flock, telling them only that Hogwarts was threatened, and they went gladly to the ramparts to stand and be broken in its defense. They were not alone for long. Through the tunnel from the Hog's Head, moving now against the tide of departing children, came the ones who had been summoned by the warm coins and the whispered word, the members of the Order of the Phoenix and of Dumbledore's army, grown and half-grown, hurrying up out of the dark. Kingsley Shacklebolt came, and Remus Lupin, and Nymphadora Tonks, who had left her newborn son sleeping in his grandmother's care because she could not bear to sit safe while others fought. The whole family of Weasleys came, and among them Percy, long estranged, who now walked back into their midst without a single word needed. The castle that had been so watched and so silent all year was suddenly loud with the footsteps of everyone who had ever loved it. While the walls were being readied, Harry went a quieter and stranger way, for he was hunting still. Somewhere within these stones, he believed, was hidden a lost crown, the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, one of the enemy's broken pieces of soul, and he could not think how to find a thing that had lain lost for centuries. So he sought out the one who might remember it, the pale drifting ghost of Ravenclaw Tower, the Grey Lady, and there, in a cold and empty corridor, she told him at last the sorrow she had carried in death as in life, that she had once been Helena, Rowena Ravenclaw's own daughter, who had stolen the diadem from her dying mother and fled with it, and that long ago a clever, charming boy had coaxed the secret from her and hidden the crown again in the one place in the castle where 1,000 forgotten things were kept. and Harry understood that he had passed that very hiding place already, and knew now where he had to go. Then midnight came, and with it the storm. The great shimmering dome held for a time, and then began to crack under a hammering it had never been raised to bear, and out of the black forest and the black sky the enemy came all at once, the towering giants swinging their clubs, the vast pale spiders pouring down the slopes, the hooded Death Eaters, and the cold, sweeping shapes of the Dementors overhead. The shield shattered in a slow rain of falling light, and the Battle of Hogwarts began in earnest, corridor by corridor, courtyard by courtyard, in a chaos of green and scarlet fire and breaking stone. Neville Longbottom fought upon the crumbling bridges, and Molly Weasley fought, and children stood back to back with their teachers, all of them holding a school that had never once stopped being a home. In the thick of it there came a moment of terrible and ordinary loss, for as Percy and Fred Weasley fought side by side at last, laughing even then in the way that only the truly reconciled can laugh, a wall was blown apart in one blinding roar, and when the dust had settled Fred lay still upon the floor, with the last of his laughter still upon his face. And one of the great warm family was simply, suddenly gone. And still the fighting rolled on around the fallen, because it could not stop for grief. Through all of it, Harry pressed on toward the lost crown, down at last into the vast cluttered room of hidden things, and there, among the mountains of forgotten centuries, the diadem was found, and very nearly lost again to a boy's cursed fire. A fiend fire that reared up in the shapes of burning beasts and swallowed everything it touched, until the crown itself was undone in the flames, and another fragment of the enemy's soul went screaming out of the world, so that now only the great snake Nagini and one unknowing living vessel still bound Lord Voldemort to the earth. Then, slipping back into the ruined castle, the three of them understood that the snake was kept always close beside its master, and they made their way down through the grounds to the old boarded ruin at the village edge, the Shrieking Shack, and crouched there in the dark to watch, unseen, through a gap in the walls. Within, Lord Voldemort spoke softly to Severus Snape of wands, and of loyalty, and of a power he meant to make wholly his own, and then, in cold and sudden need, he set his great snake upon the silent man, and left him to die upon the dusty floor. And when the enemy had gone, Harry went in to the dying man, who spent the very last of his strength to give up a thin silver stream of memory drawn from his own falling tears, and who looked once more into the boy's eyes, that were his mother's eyes, before the light went slowly out of him. Even as it happened, the cold, high voice fell across the whole exhausted castle again, granting a single hour's respite, bidding them tend their dead, and calling the boy alone into the forbidden forest to end it. So Harry gathered the shining silver into a small flask and carried it back through a castle laid open with grief, past the long still row of the fallen in the great hall, where the Weasleys wept over Fred, and where Remus Lupin and his young wife lay quiet side by side. And he climbed at last toward a quiet office and a shallow stone basin, ready to pour in the memories of the one man he had always been most certain he understood. Up next in Chapter 17, The Prince's Tale, we'll, in the stillness of the headmaster's study, high above the roar and ruin of the battle, the boy tipped the silvery threads that Severus Snape had given him with his dying breath into the wide stone basin of the Pensieve. And he bowed his face down into the cool cloud of memory and let himself fall through the years. And the world he came down into was not the castle at all, but a small gray playground in a shabby Muggle town, where two little girls in ordinary clothes played upon the swings, and a thin, sallow boy with lank black hair and hungry eyes watched them from the shadow of the bushes with a fierce and secret longing. The younger of the two girls, red-haired and green-eyed, leapt from her swing and hung a moment in the air far longer than any child should, and the watching boy knew her at once for what she was, for he was Severus Snape, and the girl was Lily Evans, and this was the first slow morning of a love that would shape everything that came after. Very gently, the memory carried the boy forward through the tender seasons of that early friendship, through summers by the little river where Severus, in his ill-fitting coat, taught Lily in a low and wondering voice about Dementors and Hogwarts and the Ministry, about all the hidden world that waited to receive her, and about the unhappy house he came from, where a Muggle father and a witch mother quarreled behind thin walls, and the boy watching saw how Petunia, the elder sister, turned sour and frightened and jealous of the magic she could not share, and how she came in time to call it all a freakishness, so that a small cold wound opened in the family that would never truly heal. Yet between Severus and Lily there was only warmth in those years, an easy closeness woven of secrets and hope, and the boy in the pensieve felt the ache of it settle softly over him like dusk. Then the scene shifted to the scarlet train and its billowing steam, and there the young Severus and the young Lily sat together in a compartment, whispering of the school that awaited them, until two other boys came laughing through the door, James Potter and Sirius Black, careless and golden and quick to mock the sallow, shabby boy who wished so hard to be sorted into Slytherin. And the boy watching saw the small seed of an old hatred planted in that moment, and he saw, too, how the great hall received them not long after, how the tattered hat called Lily to the table of Gryffindor and called Severus to the green and silver of Slytherin, and how the two friends were parted by the houses, even as they clung to each other still across the widening gap. Slowly, tenderly, the memories showed the friendship fraying, for Severus sank deeper year by year among the young witches and wizards who dabbled in the dark arts and dreamed of blood and purity, boys named Mulciber and Avery, whose cruelties Lily could not forgive, and though she pleaded with him and defended him and clung to the memory of the river, he would not let those friends go. And the boy watching came at last to the terrible bright afternoon by the lake, when James Potter, idle and vain, hung Severus upside down in the air for the amusement of a laughing crowd, and Lily ran forward to defend him, and Severus, wild with shame and helpless fury, turned upon the one person who had never abandoned him, and spat at her the ugliest word he knew, the word that named her Muggle, born and unworthy. And the moment that word left him, the boy watching knew that something had broken that could not be mended. Later, in a corridor by the tower where the Gryffindors slept, the young Severus waded through the long night to beg her forgiveness, huddled and desperate against the wall, and Lily came out to him pale and quiet, and told him, without cruelty and without hope, that she could not be his friend any longer, for he had chosen his road and she could not walk it with him. And so they parted, and the boy watching felt the loss of it as a cold and final thing, and he understood for the first time the shape of the sorrow that had lived inside Severus Snape for all the years he had known him. The memories darkened then and quickened. The boy saw Severus, grown now and cloaked as a Death Eater, crouched upon a wild and windswept hilltop, begging Albus Dumbledore for a mercy he had no right to ask, for Severus had carried to his master the first half of a prophecy overheard through a door at the Hog's Head, and only afterward had he understood that the words might mark Lily and her husband and her infant son for death, and now, stricken with a horror that had burned away all his pride, he pleaded that she be hidden, that she be spared, that she be kept safe, whatever the cost. And Dumbledore, cold with contempt for the man who would save the woman and let her family die, asked him at last what he would give in return, and Severus, broken open, answered that he would give anything at all. But the shield could not hold, and the memories showed the ruined house at Godric's Hollow, and Severus arriving too late upon a night of quiet stars, gathering the dead Lily into his arms upon the floor of her cottage and making a sound of grief so raw that the boy watching had to turn his face away. And there, in the deepest part of his loss, Severus bound himself to the old man's cause, not for love of any side, but for love of her, and he swore to keep her son alive and to protect him always in secret, asking only that Dumbledore never reveal the best of him, never tell the boy the truth of why he labored on. And when Dumbledore asked, long years afterward, whether he had grown to care for the child at last, Severus conjured a silver doe from the tip of his wand, the very likeness of Lily's own Patronus, and when the old man marveled that after so much time the shape had never changed, Severus told him, quietly and without pretense, that it was always, that it would be forever, always. The last of the memories came softly and most terribly of all. The boy saw Dumbledore's hand blackened and dying from the ruined ring he had worn, and saw how Severus had halted the curse and bought him but a single year, and saw the two of them plan together the old man's death so that a boy named Draco might be spared the ruin of murder, and Severus might keep his place among the enemy. He saw the silver doe leading him through the snow of the forest to the sword beneath the frozen pool. And at the very end he heard Dumbledore say the thing that changed the whole shape of the world, that on the night his mother died a fragment of Voldemort's torn soul had broken away and fastened itself to the only living thing left in that house, so that the boy himself had become the final Horcrux, the last piece that must be destroyed, and that he had been kept alive and cared for all these years so that he might die at the right moment by Voldemort's own hand. And Severus, aghast, understood that he had raised the lamb for the slaughter, and turned away his face, and wept without shame in the quiet of the memory. The boy rose slowly out of the pensieve, into the empty office, into the low gray light, and the distant thunder of the battle. And he stood a long while unmoving, for he knew now what he had never let himself know, that he must walk into the forest and let the enemy strike him down, that he must give himself up to death so that the last shard of the dark soul might perish with him. Up next in Chapter 18. The Forest and the Quiet Station. When the boy rose at last from the silver basin of the pensieve, the borrowed memories of the man who had loved his mother settling slowly into place within him, he carried out of that quiet office a knowledge heavier than any weight he had ever borne. He understood now the thing that had waited for him at the end of every road, the secret folded inside the old headmaster's long and careful and tender plan. On the night his mother had died to shield him, a fragment of the enemy's torn and ruined soul had broken loose and fastened itself, unasked, to the only living creature left in that shattered room, and so the boy himself had become the last and least expected of the Horcruxes, a living vessel for a splinter of the very darkness he had sworn to end. While that splinter dwelt in him, the enemy could not truly be killed, and so the boy came to understand, with a calm that felt almost like sleep, that he must walk out to meet his death and let it happen. There was no anger left in him as he understood it, and no wild wish to run. A great stillness had come over him instead, a strange and level quiet, as though he had already stepped a little way outside his own life and could look back on it kindly. He drew the soft silver folds of the invisibility cloak about his shoulders, the last of the 3 deathly Hallows, and he went down through the sleeping castle unseen, past the wounded and the weeping, past the long rows of the dead laid out in the great hall, where the red-haired family he loved knelt over one of their own. He did not let himself go in among them, for he knew that if he paused to be comforted, he would never be able to leave, and so he passed by like a ghost of himself and went out at last into the cold grounds under a sky, just beginning to think of dawn. Near the edge of the dark trees he came upon a friend, the round-faced boy named Neville, wan-torn and bloodied and unbowed, and to him the boy gave a last quiet charge without ever explaining why. Should the chance ever come, Neville was to strike down the great serpent, the enemy's beloved familiar and the keeper of the final fragment of his soul, for that snake was the last thing standing between the enemy and his ending. Then the boy went on alone toward the forbidden forest, and as he walked he drew from within his robes the small golden ball that had been the first he ever caught, the snitch that had opened for him only at the very close. He pressed it to his lips and breathed against it that he was about to die, and the golden shell cracked softly open in his palm to reveal the small black stone set within, the resurrection stone, the second of the Hallows, carved with the mark of the 3 brothers. He turned it over 3 times in his trembling hand, and out of the gray air about him there rose 4 figures, not ghosts and not truly flesh, but something gentler than memory, more real than any painting. His father came, young and untroubled, and his mother with her kind bright eyes, and the godfather who had wished to give him a home, and the tired, quiet man who had taught him to cast light against despair. They gathered close around him and walked with him toward the trees, and they told him softly that they had never truly left him, that they lived within him still, that dying was quicker and easier by far than falling asleep, and that they would stay beside him until the very end, and he would not have to be afraid. Warmed by their nearness, held up by their love as surely as by any spell, the boy walked deeper into the ancient forest, where the light failed and the great trees leaned together overhead. He let the black stone slip from his fingers and fall among the roots, and the gentle figures did not vanish so much as thin into the shadows as he went, still watching over him. At the heart of the wood he came upon a wide clearing lit by a single cold fire, and there the enemy stood waiting among his gathered servants, tall and pale and terrible, the great snake circling and coiling in a shimmering charmed sphere at his side. The Death Eaters sat in a silent ring, and among them the giant gamekeeper was bound and helpless, grieving already for the boy he did not yet know had come. For a long moment the boy stood hidden at the clearing's edge and looked upon his death, and then he slipped the cloak from his shoulders and let himself be seen. A great hush fell, and then a cry, and the enemy rose to face the boy who had haunted all his years. There was no duel and no defense, for the boy had chosen this and would not lift his wand, and the enemy, seeing him unresisting, drew back his own pale wand and spoke the curse that ends all things. A jet of green light leapt across the clearing, and the boy felt neither its heat nor its pain, only a soft and sudden ending, as though a lamp had been gently blown out and the whole world had folded quietly away into nothing at all. And then, out of that nothing, there came a place. The boy found himself lying on a cool, clean floor beneath a wide, bright vault of light, and slowly, as he wished for it, the emptiness took on the shape of a great and gleaming railway station, hushed and misty and utterly deserted, a station that looked very like the one where he had first been carried into the hidden world so many years before. He was unhurt and unmarked, and warm robes gathered themselves about him as he thought of them, and everything was clean and silent, and full of a pale golden light. Beneath a distant bench there lay one small wretched thing, a raw and shuddering creature no larger than a child, flayed and abandoned and past all help, whimpering where it had been cast, and the boy understood with a quiet pity that this maimed and dying scrap was the fragment of the enemy's soul that had lived so long inside him, ended now and beyond any mending he could offer. Then, out of the bright distance there, came walking a figure the boy had grieved for through a long, hard year, the old headmaster with his silver beard and his half-moon glasses, whole and untroubled and glad. They sat together in that place between places, and the old man told him at last the whole of the truth, with nothing hidden. He told him that the splinter of soul had died beneath the enemy's own curse, and that the boy yet lived because the enemy, in his hunger, had once taken the boy's blood into his own remade body, and so had tethered the boy to life for as long as he himself endured. He spoke of his own old sorrows, of a friendship gone to ruin, of a sister lost, of a hand blackened by a cursed ring, and of the long temptation of those 3 deadly Hallows, and he confessed that the true master of death was not the one who gathered such treasures, but the one who met his own ending without fear. And gently he laid before the boy a choice: to go on aboard a train into whatever lay beyond, or to go back and finish the work that only he could finish. And the boy, who loved the living too well to leave them, chose to return. The bright station and the kindly old face began to fade, the mist folding softly inward, and the boy felt himself drawn back down into weight and cold and the smell of earth. He lay very still upon the forest floor, holding his breath, keeping his eyes shut, listening to the frightened murmuring all around him, and he felt slender hands upon him, a pale mother searching in the dark for word of her own lost son. Up next in Chapter 19, the last duel at dawn will, when Harry Potter opened his eyes again upon the cold floor of the Forbidden Forest, the quiet white station and the gentle counsel he had received there faded softly behind him, and he lay very still among the roots and the fallen leaves, keeping his breath shallow and his body loose, so that to any watching eye he might seem no more than the dead boy Voldemort believed him to be. All around the clearing there was a strange hush, for the Dark Lord himself had been thrown down for a moment by the very curse he had cast, and while his followers waited in fear for their master to gather his strength, a woman was sent to be certain the boy was truly gone. Her name was Narcissa Malfoy, and she knelt in the leaf mold and pressed her hand against Harry's chest, and under the cover of her long fair hair she felt the living heartbeat beating there, and she asked him in the smallest of whispers whether her son was alive within the castle. When Harry breathed the one soft word that told her Draco still lived, she rose and turned to the waiting crowd and spoke the lie that would help to save them all, declaring the boy dead, for her heart had long since ceased to serve anyone but her child. So it was that the Death Eaters marched down out of the trees in a slow and dreadful procession, and Voldemort in his triumph forced poor weeping Hagrid to carry the body of the boy he loved like a son, cradled in his great arms, all the long way across the dark grounds toward the broken castle. The defenders gathered upon the ruined steps saw them come, and when the Dark Lord announced in his high cold voice that Harry Potter was dead, killed while fleeing, a terrible cry of grief went up from the courtyard, from Ginny and from Ron, and from Hermione and from all the others, a sound so raw that even the still boy in Hagrid's arms felt it pierce him. Voldemort savored the anguish, offering mercy to any who would kneel, and for a long moment the fight seemed truly over, the school subdued, the resistance broken beneath its sorrow. Then, Out of the crowd of the beaten and the mourning, one figure walked forward alone, limping and bloodied, his face swollen and defiant, and it was Neville Longbottom. He would not kneel, and he would not be silent, and though Voldemort mocked him and drew him near, Neville spoke instead of loyalty and of courage and of all the friends who had fallen and were not gone, and he told the assembled darkness that Harry Potter still lived on in every heart that would not surrender. In cruel amusement, the Dark Lord summoned the old Sorting Hat from the castle and set it upon the boy's head and lit it into flame, meaning to make of Neville a lesson to them all. Yet in that very instant many things broke loose at once, for Grop the giant came blundering round the castle wall, and the great winged thestrals and hippogriffs came sweeping down upon the giants of the enemy, and in the confusion, Harry slipped unseen from Hagrid's arms and threw his father's invisibility cloak about himself, and Neville, wreathed in fire, reached up into the burning brim of the Sorting Hat and drew from it the gleaming silver sword of Godric Gryffindor, and with one clean and ringing stroke he struck the head from the great serpent Nagini, so that the last living Horcrux fell dead upon the stones, and Lord Voldemort screamed as another piece of his splintered soul was torn away forever. Then the battle broke open once more, wilder than before, and the defenders and the reinforcements from Hogsmeade drove the Death Eaters back through the shattered doors and into the castle itself. The fighting swept at last into the great hall, that long and lofty room where these children had once been sorted and had once eaten their feasts beneath the enchanted ceiling, and now it rang with curses and with breaking stone. In the very thick of it, 3 of the darkest of Voldemort's servants pressed hard upon Ginny and Hermione and Luna, and Bellatrix Lestrange laughed as her wand came within a hair of killing Ginny where she stood. At that sight a fury rose in Molly Weasley such as no one had ever seen in her, and the gentle mother of the burrow flung the others aside and took the Mad Witch for her own, and the 2 women dueled across the flagstones while the jets of light flew wide around them. In the end it was Molly, defending her children with everything she was, whose curse found its mark, and struck Bellatrix Lestrange down dead, so that the cruelest of all the Dark Lord's followers fell at last beneath a mother's hand. Voldemort turned in his rage to strike Molly where she stood, and in that heartbeat Harry cast off the invisibility cloak and threw a shining shield charm between them, and the whole hall fell silent as the boy who was said to be dead stood living before them all. The 2 of them began to circle each other slowly beneath the ruined ceiling, wands raised, and Harry spoke now not in anger but in a strange and steady calm, for he had learned in the forest the secret that would end it. He told the Dark Lord that no more of his enemies would die that night, and he began to explain, gently and without fear, the one thing Voldemort in all his cunning had never understood. He spoke of the Elder Wand, the Wand of Destiny that Voldemort had stolen from the White Tomb by the lake, and he told him that it had never truly answered to him at all. For a wand of that kind belongs to the one who wins it, and its true allegiance had passed by a long and hidden chain the Dark Lord had never guessed. It had not been Severus Snape who mastered that wand by killing Albus Dumbledore upon the tower, for the old headmaster had already been disarmed a moment before by young Draco Malfoy, and so the wand had bowed to Draco, whether he knew it or not. And then, in the courtyard of Malfoy Manor, it had been Harry who overpowered Draco and took his ordinary hawthorn wand from his hand, and in that quiet, unnoticed struggle, the mastery of the Elder Wand had passed on again, from Draco to Harry, so that the greatest wand in the world now belonged, in its own silent way, to the boy who stood facing its thief. Beyond the high windows of the great hall, the first gray light of morning was climbing over the mountains, and the enchanted ceiling began to pale from black toward the tender colors of the dawn. Voldemort would not believe it, and in his fury and his fear he raised the Elder Wand and cast the killing curse one final time, and Harry, in the same breath, cast only the simple charm that disarms, and the two spells met in the widening light between them. But the wand that Voldemort held would not slay its own true master, and the deadly curse rebounded upon the one who sent it, and the Elder Wand tore itself from his grasp and spun high through the golden air into Harry's waiting hand. So Tom Riddle, who had torn his soul into pieces to escape it, fell at last to a plain and mortal death, his body dropping to the floor with a finality that no dark art could undo. And the sun broke fully over the horizon and poured its clean light across the hall. The war was over, and the long and terrible night was ended, and a stunned and weeping silence gave way slowly to a joy too vast for any words. Up next, in Chapter 20, 19 years and all was well, Wheel. When the last curse had rebounded in the great hall, and the pale, ruined figure had fallen for the final time, and the light that filled the ancient windows was no longer the flash of spellfire, but only the plain gray light of an ordinary morning, the long war was over. And in the strange, ringing quiet that followed, Harry Potter understood that the whole of the story had at last begun to set itself down. He had mended his own broken wand with the borrowed power of the wand that had chosen him, and then, rather than keep the most perilous of the three Hallows for himself, he had chosen to return it to the White Tomb by the lake, so that its terrible mastery might one day fade quietly out of the world and trouble no one ever again. He had climbed the moving stairs to a familiar round tower and a familiar four-poster bed, and he had slept as he had not slept in a year, and when he woke the world was gently, ordinarily, mercifully new. The years that came after were not a tale of battles, and that was their whole quiet blessing. The castle was healed stone by stone, and the fallen were laid to rest and remembered. And slowly the wizarding world settled back into its small and gentle rhythms, its owls and its shops, its kettles and its clocks. Harry married Ginny Weasley, whose fierce warmth had waited for him through all the dark years, and Ron and Hermione were wed as well, so that the friendships forged in a train carriage long ago grew at last into a single wide and tangled family. Children came in their turn, and the houses filled with noise and firelight, and the scar upon Harry's brow, which had burned and ached through so many nights, fell silent and cool, and was, most days, entirely forgotten. And so, one soft season after another, 19 autumns quietly turned. On the first day of September in that 19th year, a light mist lay over London, and the great echoing vault of King's Cross Station bustled and steamed as it always had, full of hurrying strangers who never once suspected the small marvel folded in among them. Toward the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 came a little procession loaded with trunks and cages, and one large, disgruntled owl, pushed along by 2 grown men and 2 women who moved through the crowd with the ease of long practice. Harry was among them now, a man of middle years, with a little gray worked into his black hair, and the same round glasses, and the same faint lightning scar. And beside him walked Ginny, and their 3 children turned and wheeled about them like leaves in a gentle wind. One after another the family leaned casually against the cold iron barrier and slipped clean through it. And on the far side the hidden platform opened before them, and the scarlet steam engine that had carried so many generations of children northward stood waiting. breathing its white clouds along the crowded stone. Their eldest boy, James, went laughing ahead into the smoke, delighted with himself and with the whole wide world. For he had already spent a year at the school and wore his knowledge lightly and loudly. He came darting back to report, with enormous glee, that he had seen Teddy far down the platform and that Teddy had been kissing Victoire, and he seemed to find in this the most scandalous and wonderful news imaginable. The Teddy he spoke of was Ted Lupin, the son of Remus and Nymphadora, orphaned as an infant in the last battle, much as Harry himself had been orphaned long ago, and raised in warmth by his grandmother, and loved as a near son by Harry across all the years between. That the boy was now grown, and half in love with the eldest daughter of Bill and Fleur, was, to the family, only another quiet turning of the same kind wheel, one generation folding gently into the next. But the middle child did not laugh. Albus, small and dark and solemn, with his mother's people written in his bones and his father's green eyes set steady in his face, walked close to Harry and would not be teased into cheer, for this was his first year, and a single fear sat heavy on his heart. He was afraid, above all things, that when he came to be sorted, he would be placed in Slytherin, the house of the serpent, the house so long shadowed by the very darkness they had all only lately survived. His father knelt to him there amid the steam and the noise, away from the others, and gently reminded the boy of the name he carried. For Albus Severus had been named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts, and one of those 2 men had belonged to Slytherin himself, and had been, in Harry's steady reckoning, perhaps the bravest soul he had ever known. And Harry told him, softly and only for the 2 of them, that the ancient hat which chose the houses would listen to a boy's own wish if the wish were strong enough, for it had once listened to his own. The words settled the child as few things could have, and something anxious in his small face grew calm. Across the crowded platform, at a little distance, stood another family, and Harry marked them without rancor. There was Draco Malfoy, older now and thinner on top, with the same pointed chin and pale coloring, standing with his wife and his own sharp-featured son, who was bound this very day for the same first year. The 2 men caught each other's eye across the drifting steam, and each gave the other a small, curt nod, no more and no less, and turned back to their children, and in that brief cool courtesy lay the whole long distance the world had traveled, from the hatreds of one age into the wary peace of the next. Nearby the wider clan gathered and jostled and teased, Ron marveling in mock despair at his clever daughter Rose, Hermione keeping her calm amid the swirl, and the 2 youngest children, little Lily and small Hugo, tugging at sleeves and pleading to be allowed aboard as well, for they were still some few years short of the age when the letters would come for them. Then the great whistle sounded down the length of the train, and there was the flurry that has ended 1,000 such mornings. The last hugs. The trunks heaved up, the doors swinging, the smaller ones lifted for a final kiss. Albus and Rose climbed aboard together, 2 nervous first years side by side, and the scarlet engine began to move, gathering itself slowly and then more surely along the platform. The parents walked beside it while they could, waving, and Albus's small pale face appeared at a lowered window, gazing back at them as the train drew him away, and Harry walked and waved and kept his son's eyes as long as the moving glass allowed. Little Lily, still too young for all of it, cried out that she wanted to go too, and was gently promised that her turn would surely come, and she pressed against her father and watched the train shrink into the northern haze with a longing that was, in its way, the tenderest thing on the whole crowded platform. The scarlet engine curved out of sight at last, and the steam thinned, and the family stood together in the ordinary bustle of the great station, with the whole wide day and the whole wide life ahead of them. And Harry, standing quiet among the ones he loved, felt the old crowd flow past unknowing, and lifted his hand once, without quite meaning to, and touched the thin white scar upon his brow. It did not hurt. It had not hurt in 19 years, and it would not hurt again, and in that small and perfect stillness he understood that the long night was truly over and the story was gently, wholly finished. The mist lay soft upon the roofs of London, and the world turned on toward its evening. And everything, at the very last, was well, and calm, and quiet, and good. And so we come softly to the end of the story. Tonight we followed the boy who lived, the letter and the giant and the hidden world, the platform and the sorting, and the stone beneath the school, the whispering chamber and the diary, the prisoner and the marauders, the goblet and the graveyard, the order and the prophecy, the half-blood prince and the cave above the sea. We walked the long wandering in the cold, the locket's weight and the empty chair, Godric's hollow and the tale of three brothers, the manor and the dragon and the vault of gold, the return to a waiting castle, and the battle in the dark. We stood inside the prince's tale. We walked with him into the forest and stood a moment at that quiet station. We watched the last duel break at dawn, and we came at last to a railway platform 19 years on, where all was well. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter, until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.